hopefully more people will be joining. But in the meantime, we can start the discussions, just knowing that if we aren't able to get a quorum by the time we get to some of the decisions that are being made, we'll have to revisit that in the next meeting. So with that, I'll hand it off to you, Dan.
Thank you. Carrie's away on business today, so stuck with me. So let's talk about our meeting objectives. This is, everybody's gotten the agenda. We're going to finish discussion and development of the plan recommendations, and we're going to receive an update on the draft plan chapters for the RBC review and begin to develop an implementation plan. I read all over the stuff yesterday. I got to tell you, my head's swimming with tables, and I mean, there's a lot of stuff we've got to cut out of this thing. It's just, you know, I'm not exactly sure who the audience is, but the stuff I read, I mean, I'm an engineer, I'm an aerospace engineer, rocket scientist. I have an issue going through it and what it means and how we gel it. So anything we can do to simplify, summarize, make it more readable would be wonderful. The other thing I asked Grace to do is, you know, I want to just go through what an outline of the RBC plan looks like, what the chapters mean. We're talking about numbers. Some of the chapters are more important than others. And then I mean, there is an executive summary that goes along with this, right?
Yes.
I mean, that's going to be the key. Because 90% of people are just going to read the executive summary, but it's, you know, it's complicated. I think we have a fair amount of work to simplify in a short period of time, as you're going to see today. So I'd like a motion to approve the agenda, please. So moved. Second. So moved.
Who was first? Sorry.
Dean and Bill Miller. And then
we'll have to do that next time. The minutes and summary.
Say again.
The minutes and summary we'll have to approve next time since we don't have.
Oh, we don't have a quorum, so we can't approve the February 6th meetings summary. So we won't do that until we have a quorum. Housekeeping, newsworthy items. I don't know much about. If we go to the next slide, I don't know much about the drought tabletop exercise.
Yeah, I can pick it up here.
Why don't you take it?
Yeah.
Thanks.
So I introduced myself to most of you, I think, before the meeting started, but my name is Grace Houghton. I'm also a water resources engineer with CDM Smith, and I'm filling in, facilitating in person for John today. But as you saw, he is joining us online. So he's been here for all of your discussions and can hopefully fill in any gaps that I might have missed. But I have been participating in these river basin plans since the first one with the Edisto a few years ago, and have been following along with yours throughout the process, a bit more in the background. But I'm excited to be here in person with you today. So for our newsworthy items, I understand there's a drought tabletop exercise that took place yesterday. So I was hoping that Brian and Lynn, I don't know if you attended that too. Okay. Brian, would you be willing to just share a few thoughts on that?
Sure. Yeah, it was a very good exercise. They had laid out 5 scenarios, which was really just one long extended drought, with scenario 1 being some moderate drought in the state, and eventually we ended up with extreme drought across the state. And in the room were folks from ag, power, water suppliers, a lot like this group as well. And just everybody kind of spoke about what they would do at each step, where their concerns would be, what they were looking for from like the drought response committee, and making those declarations, hearing how they use our information to affect the U.S. Drought Monitor, which in turn can help farmers get some aid to buy hay and other things for their livestock. But ultimately, when we got into that extreme drought scenario, the power companies were not producing power. They didn't have enough to cool their processes. It was, you know, worst case scenario, and I hope we never get there. But I think from that, there's a lot of interdependencies that got recognized between all the groups, and just that communication would be really critical going through that, because it's not like a hurricane or some other event where the emergency condition is known. It happened on this date. A drought is really a long-term thing, and you might not realize how critical it is because it just slowly crept up on you. So everybody sharing that information and being coordinated throughout is really important.
Question, Brian. Were there any numbers discussed? on what the total water supply is and what a drought means and, you know, was it just discussions of how people would handle droughts?
Yeah, it was more around assuming that the drought committee had already declared these conditions, not necessarily what went into it. There was some early discussion throughout a lot of the utilities, just kind of what's in their drought management plan, what their internal triggers are that are in addition to whatever the declaration may be for that area. And then a lot of the folks on the lakes and stuff talk about their low inflow protocol. And a lot of numbers got thrown out there for sure around lake levels and what they do in those scenarios.
Yeah, let me add that I participated in the meeting yesterday and you may talk about the drought indicators. We're gone through briefly for each scenario. So we looked at different things like rainfall, stream flow was presented to kind of support the drought condition we were in. I'm not sure that's what you're asking.
No,
That
I
was
was.
part of it too.
I was, thanks.
Hey, this is John. Can you all hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Brian or Lynn, I was just curious if after having attended the drought tabletop exercise, it made you rethink any of the recommendations that this RBC has put forth or consider any new recommendations as part of our drought response chapter 8. Did it spur any ideas or make you think of any potential recommendations that this RBC wants to consider to put forward?
I mean, one thing that I took away from it was that the ag community really feels it before it's even out there in the indicators. And a lot of times from what I heard is once it's at a state where it's bad enough for them to get aid, most things are too far gone for them to recover anyway with crops. They mentioned at that point with livestock, they're probably just going to liquidate them rather than try to take the aid. And then, yeah, ultimately just that dependency of the power companies on the water supply. And I think they threw out a stat at one point, and I don't recall what it was, but I think it was UV Talks Away. They produce like 20% of the power for their state, or Scott, I don't know if you remember exactly how they were laying that out, but there was a lot of power coming out of that one lake. And
it was Duke that said.
was it Duke? Okay.
Yeah, it was Duke Energy.
20% of their energy production is done in the Kiwi times
Okay.
water use.
Yeah, so they'd have even wider reaching impacts beyond the drought area, perhaps.
Because it wasn't just their hydroelectric that would be affected, it was their nuclear that'd be
Yes,
affected, because they're using it for cooling purposes as well.
So I think any of those dependencies should definitely be highlighted in each basin.
Okay, thank you.
Did anyone else participate? Anyone else want to add anything on that exercise?
You know, I was there and he kind of recapped the ag standpoint, you know, like you said, by the time we've already hit in the US drought monitor, by the time we've already hit sustained D3 and D4, a lot of your crops are going to be essentially a total loss. And, you know, Landrum Weathers was there, who's on the Water SC group as well. And he made a couple of comments, you know, he actually works with crop insurance as well. And, you know, a lot of that stuff is stuff that farmers are paying for. Say a lot of that stuff, crop insurance is farmers are paying for, they're paying a premium for. So you're hoping that stuff kicks in. Sometimes the triggers are misguided, I guess. There are some crop insurance folks that still do look at that state drought map, which isn't always matching up with the US drought map. The US drought map is produced weekly. And I think we're at a, what, 5 to 8 meeting on the state drought response committee.
Monthly.
Monthly.
About monthly.
But they're looking at different indicators. And whether those indicators are relevant too, that's another discussion. So
So there's a difference in how it's the drought is determined for how you're getting your crop insurance versus how.
the state drought response committee looks at the Keach fire, which is a forest fire indicator. The Palmer severity, which is a long-term indicator, US drought monitor, crop moisture index, and current rainfalls and water levels. Is that right?
Yeah, groundwater, stream flow, reservoirs. Yeah.
So
Yeah, I'll add, I think part of this exercise was to get to a severe enough drought where the emergency operations plan. I'm not sure exactly what you're calling it. It's called an EMD. We implement that plan, I think, was part of this process. So when we started the first scenario, we were already in moderate drought. So I think for the ag community, the exercise may have been a little bit more helpful in a way if you just started from no drought to recipient and gone through the conversations about the differences between the DRC and the drought monitor. Maybe more helpful for the ag community if we did it that way, which I think we've done it that way in the past.
I'll communicate with a lot of the ag folks when they're seeing D3 in their areas. Sometimes on the state map, that might only indicate incipient. In certain areas. And they'll be like, well, why, we're borderline severe right here on the US drought monitor and the state map's only showing this. Why is that? So they're just trying to make sure they understand that most of what they're should be interpreted should be that US drought. And that's a weekly and see more tool and everything else, so we can make sure that their voices get put in there as well.
Okay.
Great. Looks like your computer's moving along better, so you want to.
Oh, thanks. Yep.
And Grace, we're actually seeing the preview PowerPoint screen as well. If you could switch the display again back to the full screen.
Yeah. All right, well, thank you. When we get back into the recommendations, if there's anything we want to revisit from the drought tabletop exercise that does come up, we can always do that then. For newsworthy items too, just want to quickly note that there was an inter-river basin council meeting on Tuesday that just a couple of members from each of the Upper Savannah and the Lower Savannah-Salkehatchie joined. And out of that came some discussion of recommendations and if there's any ways to try to better align the recommendations coming out of the two basins to give some more force behind them to be considered in the state water plan. So there were a couple of changes and potential recommendations that the representatives on the Lower Savannah-Salkehatchie thought would be worth bringing back to the full group today. So when we get into the recommendations later, we can talk a little bit more about that. Okay.
One other thing, if that's okay, the
Yeah.
PD river basin plan was approved on Tuesday as well, so that one is finalized.
So now is the public and agency comment period. If there are any members of the public or agency online that would make a comment, now is the time.
Can I add something from yesterday?
Of course.
We were kind of having a side conversation at our table. And I think one of the things that was brought up is the fines for water usage or continued normal water usage during a drought period. They're very minimal. I don't know if that should be something that should be discussed in recommendations out of this group or not, but I think it's up to $500 or something like that. And if you're a large industry and you're using water and you're going to continue to use water, you're just going to pay the fine to keep rolling.
Okay.
Just a note.
Yeah, thank you for bringing that up and circle back to that for the recommendation.
Very sorry to keep interrupting, but we
Yeah,
do
no,
have a
please
quorum
do.
now, so if we want to go ahead and approve the minutes, that would be great.
Okay.
If anyone wants to
We have a
move,
motion
can.
to approve, I think the agenda first,
Yeah,
second, and then the minutes from the last meeting. Same two, good, we got it.
I didn't read the minutes, so I won't second it, so since I wasn't here.
John, thank you. All
I'll say.
all four?
Yes.
Any opposed? Approved.
All right, great. Next, we'll just do a quick recap of what happened at the February meeting, and I'm actually going to hand that back over to John virtually as he was leading that meeting.
Sure, thank you, Grace. If you can go to the next slide. So if you remember last meeting, we spent a good part of the meeting talking about water management strategies. And the information from last meeting has been put into a draft of Chapter 7. You're going to get a copy of Chapter 7 for review tomorrow. It's going to highlight the fact that we recognize there's already a lot of supply side strategies in use in the basin, including reclaimed water for irrigation, on-site retention of stormwater for both golf and ag, conjunctive use, so use of both ground and surface water is very common. We talked about the fact there's interconnections and there's been regionalization of public systems, interbasin transfers, and then ASR. All of those are common strategies on the supply side. What we focus more on then, if you go to the next slide, is what demand side strategies do we want to recommend for use in the basin? And we went through a list of strategies that have been used in other places and that most of the other RBCs have considered. And we kind of narrowed it down to ones that we thought were most effective within the lower Savannah and Salkehatchie basins. And that's what you see on the screen. And we talked a little bit about prioritization. We decided not to prioritize any one strategy over another. We did talk about the importance of public education. That might be a little bit of a higher strategy or higher priority strategy. But generally, we decided not to prioritize them, and we're going with this list of municipal demand side strategies. If you go to the next slide, Grace, we also just quickly reviewed some similar strategies that apply both to industrial and energy water users. And we got some feedback that says that, yes, generally all of these are supported, but again, there's not really a prioritization we're going to set on any of these. And that's been a common theme, I think, in most of the RBCs when we've talked about both industrial and energy conservation and efficiency strategies. So this is a common list that has been carried throughout the state for all the RBCs. And then finally, we talked a little bit about irrigation, ag and golf water efficiency strategies. But at the time, we didn't have any of our farmer representatives in the room. So I did reach out to them in a separate email and explained that we're looking for their input on this list of strategies. And I got some great feedback from nearly all of them, from Joey Oswald, from Angel, Brad O'Neill, Samuel Grubbs, and even I think Sam Quinney, who's in the room there, provided feedback. And there was a lot of consistency within the feedback that they provided. The common themes I heard were that every one of these strategies is considered a best management practice for most farmers in the basins, and they typically employ nearly all of these. Now, there was a few that were suggested as a higher priority by both Joey and Sam Grubbs, and that's soil management and cover cropping. They said that is most important, and to reap the maximum benefits from some of these other strategies, you need to be doing effective soil management and employing cover cropping. So that one may it was considered a little bit of a higher priority than the others, just so you can maximize benefits of the others. Angel commented that the strategy focused on crop variety, crop type, and crop conversions. So that's, that has to do with kind of switching crops to lower water demand crops or lower varieties of the same crops that might not need as much water demand. She suggested that one is not really supported, at least in her experience. And that's because you often have to do equipment changes if you're just switching out the crop you're growing. That can be expensive. And that we've heard this in some of the other RBCs too, especially in the Edisto. The type of crop that's grown is often market driven. So you can't just easily say, well, I'm going to grow a less water intensive crop and switch from corn to, I don't know, soybeans or something. The economics might not work out. So Angel suggested that that's not a strategy that she would necessarily promote. However, the other growers that provided feedback didn't really rule that one out necessarily. So based on that feedback, we're going to write up Chapter 7 to kind of reflect their thoughts and ideas, and you'll see a draft of that tomorrow. So any questions about that? All right, well, look forward to reviewing a draft of chapter 7 beginning tomorrow. It's a relatively short chapter. And it will summarize this discussion on water management strategies for all the sectors. So thank you.
Great, thank you, John. Okay, next is an update on the draft chapters. So by Ken's request, I'm just going to take a minute to pull up a description of what each of these chapters are. And to do that, let me just go to the table of contents from the Upper Savannah's draft River Basin Plan. So section 1 is the introduction. It provides a lot of the background of the planning process, what the RBC has developed as its vision and goals, talks about public outreach, previous efforts, and then how the plan is organized. And all of this is basically dictated by the state planning framework as what needs to be in this section and for all of these sections. So I hear the comment that there's a lot of information to keep track of in here. We're trying to go by what the framework has stated needs to be in here, but anywhere where there is flexibility and you all have any feedback as to how to make this hit better, please let us know. Section 2 is a description of the basin. So this is one of the chapters that you have been given to review. So it covers the physical environment, climate, natural resources, ag resources, socioeconomic background. Chapter 3 is the water resources of the basin, summarizing surface water and groundwater, how the plan addresses the availability of those resources, talking about the SWAM model, and then discussion of groundwater resources. Chapter 4 summarizes the current demands, how much is permitted and registered in the basin, and then the demand projections, the moderate and the high demand and that high growth scenario. Chapter 5 then goes through the assessment of surface water availability. So how we use the models or analysis that's been done without a model for now for groundwater to look at what those different demand scenarios are and how that impacts the surface water resources of the basin. Note where there are any projected shortages, impacts to basic stream metrics, and looking at ecology. We also summarize the safe yield of the reservoirs. 6 is going through the surface water management strategies. So that's where we describe in more detail what some of these conservation measures are that the RBC has put forward, what they are, some concepts of costs and benefits for each of them. Yeah, there were no supply side strategies for this basin. Then 7, what John was just talking about, is where we present the recommended water management strategies. So there were those were those 3 categories of the municipal, ag, and the industry conservation measures. Also talk about any remaining shortages and issues for reaches of interest or groundwater areas of concern, and the concept of adaptive management and how that can be used for additional strategies in the basin. 8 is another chapter that has been given out for review. This is drought response, covers what the Drought Management Act is, how that works in the state and in the basin. And then it goes through what the RBC's role is for drought response. And that's where we include any of the drought specific recommendations that the RBC develops. Chapter 9 is where we present the policy, legislative, regulatory, technical, and planning process recommendations. So that's what you've been working on over the last 3 meetings and what we'll hopefully be wrapping up today. And then 10 is the implementation plan, where we take all of those recommendations that are presented in chapters 7 for the water management strategies, chapter 8 for the drought recommendations, and then all of the chapter 9 recommendations, and lay out how the RBC will aim to implement those recommendations. And not that the RBC is doing everything, but they would be driving forward the recommendations and lobbying them for whoever may need to take action to make them happen. But helpful for some background. Anyone have any questions on that?
I do. If you put up the chapter order, back on the slide that we have on today. So I guess my question to you all is, it seems to me that the key chapter is chapter 5. I mean, when we got together in 2023 in Blackville, we were given, I thought, the task. I looked at the slides last night of, is there enough quantity of water in the basin to satisfy current and projected future needs in different scenarios? To me, quantity is a number, right? So we're coming up with strategies, but we don't know the answer to number 5. Yeah, we don't know if there's enough quantity. Do we have a problem or not, right? I mean, that's going to feed in the state water program. So, I mean, anything we can do, John, to accelerate number 5, just so we can see, because, you know, we should be using good water management practices. You know, we should be doing that in the state of South Carolina, low flow, everything we should. But we don't know in this basin if we have an issue or not. And that's part of my problem, trying to get my hand around. That's the last chapter to come out, but yet we're doing all these strategies and we don't know how it relates to whether we have an issue or not. Right. So just a comment I make, I struggle with that.
So I can try to address that, Grace. We could send out a draft version of chapter 5 right now, if you'd like, that focuses on the surface water results. So, you know, we did cover the results of the surface water modeling, which looked at each one of the planning scenarios we wanted to evaluate, right? Current use, moderate, high demand through 2070, even permitted and registered, and an unimpaired flow scenario. And at previous meetings, we've talked about those results, and we saw that for the most part, there weren't any projected shortages in either basin, except with regard to some of the users in smaller tributaries, some of the ag users in the Salkehatchie especially. But again, we also talked about the fact the model doesn't include the small impoundments that they rely on to get them through those dry times. So we've covered the water availability analysis, and we can send out the surface water summary of chapter 5. What we're waiting on is for Brooke to complete the groundwater availability description. And I think 2 meetings ago, you know, Brooke presented kind of an overview of her assessment of current and future conditions, given that we're not going to be doing groundwater modeling, and given her until the end of the month to add in her piece. But if you'd like to start to review the surface water part of chapter 5, we can certainly send that out earlier if you think that'd be useful, Ken.
I think it would, but are we gonna, I'm not clear on if we have a number of quantities of groundwater for the basin. Are we gonna guess? Are we gonna take an engineer's estimate? I mean, how are we gonna handle that? Because again, the mission was quantity, not quality, but is there enough quantity for current future demands under various scenarios? And groundwater is part of that. So how are we going to handle that, John?
John Carmen here, and I just want to second that we're missing a critical piece of information and data without the USGS groundwater data that is delayed by some period of time. Do we have an update on when to expect that data? And then when and how would Brooke be able to add that data to her calculations?
Yeah, maybe I'll let Brooke and Scott speak to that. Brooke's not doing any calculations per se. She's mainly looking at past trends, looking at future demands, and trying to do some desktop type of analysis and projections about where, you know, she potentially sees problems, or if she sees problems. And she reviewed that 2 months ago. Scott, can you speak to the availability of the USGS models? Is that 6 months away, a year away? Do you know?
Yeah, the groundwater model will not be ready for this iteration plan, so it's not going to be incorporated into this plan. So our key recommendation in this plan ought to be, you know, we need to complete the groundwater work, and we still have a contract with USGS to complete that modeling exercise. We are meeting with them periodically to get updates on what they call the parent model calibration. Once that parent model is calibrated, then they'll start making more region-specific modeling based on the parent model. And I think it's really going to be summer for the parent model calibration to be completed and reviewed by us and approved. And then they'll start working on the regional models, hopefully late summer and fall. I hope to, even if, you know, this plan's gonna get done without that component in it, but I hope that there'll be opportunities for DES to engage y'all in progress and even show you some of the results at some point within the next year and a half. So I want to build that into this. But it's
So
not
the
gonna be
report
incorporated into the
note
plan.
the delayed arrival of that model. And then set a ticker, if you will, for review in a year or whatever by the River Council. Yeah, I'm just concerned about it being not mentioned, out of sight, out of mind, and there's a deficiency here in how we're addressing groundwater without that model in there. And that-
Well, I think the water plan should state that.
Okay.
Yeah, and
It did in the
it'll acknowledge the model, and you should acknowledge that you weren't able to complete the groundwater assessment as intended, and that needs to be done. And yeah, it's. Yeah, that's the best I can do, right?
Yeah, that,
Right.
it will be noted in the plan, basically that way, that there wasn't a groundwater model available for this part of the planning process, and it is in progress, and hopefully for the next five-year update of the River Basin plan, we would then be able to use that to do this full assessment.
And it is a deficiency.
But however, go ahead.
It's, and I apologize for this not, you know, if I've lost the bubble on this, but so it's a requirement that we finish our plan within X time period. Regardless of the fact that we're acknowledging that we don't have this key. I'm just asking, I mean, so it must be finished and stamped and done and. But we're gonna have this big.
Yeah.
And to that, I mean, we're all engineers here. There's no kind of rule of thumb we can make on assessments of how much groundwater is in each aquifer versus the demand withdrawals that we can say, you know, I mean. You
Yeah,
know,
I'll let Brooke weigh in. You certainly can try such exercises, but your error bars. Is it worth that exercise? No.
Yeah, I mean, you don't typically assign an aquifer of like a volumetric amount of water that's in there, and we just don't have the numbers. We don't have the recharge, discharge, or what the model, where it's moving through layers to be able to figure out how much water is in there. Now we could, you know, take the depth of it and the width of it and that, but then we would still have all this hand waving and we would not have an accurate assessment of how much water is in there, because then if we start putting numbers on that, then we start estimating how much we actually have to use based on those numbers, and those numbers will be incorrect.
But how could we possibly issue permits on withdrawals if we have no idea what they're withdrawing against? It doesn't make any sense to me.
Well, the only thing that we can look at right now is that we have decades of water use and decades of water levels that we've made maps to. We look at the trends that have occurred, you know, in relation to how much recharge has happened, you know, with that checks and balances ins and outs. But that's the best that we can do right now. And the model will essentially perform those calculations, you know, also. So there's uncertainty involved in the model. But I mean, it's the best that we can do right now. And I think that we try to take a conservative approach by looking at all of the water levels and maps and water use that we can, and then look at those projections and identify areas that could be impacted. Now, in this basin, there are no areas of concern besides in Hilton Head with that, and that is out of state pumping. And so we have not seen any large declines in water levels over time to make us look at an area intentionally right now, because we just don't have the data. And what we can suggest is that we can monitor areas, you know, more frequently. We can add wells where we find that data are lacking, but without the model, I mean, we understand that, you know, it's a deficiency in this plan, but, you know, we had to move forward with the PD plan without a model, and acknowledge that, you know, we need modeling because we can't accurately estimate, you know, what additional pumping is going to do to the aquifer. So, that's just where we are right now, where we are mandated to finish these. And
We don't have the flexibility to build in delays at this point.
we didn't anticipate the groundwater model.
No, and
Taking
I'm
the
not
time.
suggesting a delay. I don't think, I'm just suggesting it's hard to do the mission you're set out to do
Yeah.
without the data. And so our results are gonna be indicative, inconclusive, and surface water bias. Really, right? So I mean, that's all. I was trying to get, yeah.
The point I'll make is that in theory, this plan will be renewed and updated in 5 years. Is that the plan?
Yes.
5 years? So the question for me on the table is, based upon our projection of demand increases between now and let's just say 2030, do we have enough water in the system to reasonably start accommodating that? Are we making projections on an enormous expansion in demand, in groundwater demand in the basin? And as far as I can tell, the answer to that question is no. We're looking at continued growth along the coastal zone, where people are going to demand more water. We have surface water, which takes up a significant portion of that area, both in Jasper County and in Beaufort County. And we have increasing demand, I think, in the upper part of the Savannah Basin, which is relying on groundwater, if I'm correct, a lot of it up there. But I think the issue is we need to be specific about the need for the model. We need to be specific about the fact that there's so much we don't know. But I don't think we're facing a crisis here. We have to rebuild this plan again in 5 years. And so there's going to be, and by that time, quote unquote, hopefully, we will have a model that we can look at and make judgments on. If there's a policy position we need to say to the state, you need to take, because we don't know, to me, that becomes a critical recommendation in the plan. If we have to say to the state of South Carolina, you should not permit any groundwater withdrawals in area X, area Y, wherever it is, because we just don't know. And we could make that decision today, and 10 years from now, we could find the wells drying up. So to me, that's a political, I don't say political, but it's a rational recommendation based upon the fact that we don't know exactly what we're going to be doing. And that's the way I think you got to program this.
The second meeting in Estill, when we were in Estill, I asked the question, what's the problem? And I've been trying to solve that the whole time that I've been here. And I don't think we have a problem, from what I can tell, just looking at the model is not the truth, it's a tool, correct? But and we can all pick apart issues with the surface model, and I'm certain we'll be able to do that even more so with the groundwater model. But it indicates that we don't have a problem. So I'm hesitant to put all these restrictions and everything, but we ought to say, make a model so we have a better tool. But I don't think, just from me sitting here for how long it's been, that we have a problem. So
Yeah, the only problem we have is that the city of Savannah and Southwest Georgia now is impacting has been impacting our groundwater supply in Southern Beaufort County now for 50 years, 60 years. And we have not done anything about that. I've been participating and working on this for 40 years in this county, and there has never been an effort, significant effort, despite pressure from the state, to resolve those issues with.
the coordination between both sides of the river.
That to me,
first.
from the perspective of both surface water and groundwater, the significant recommendation that this plan can make Savannah Basin and the areas that we've defined along the coast is you got to sit down with Georgia and you got to work out a deal. I mean, that to me is number one.
I agree. 100%. We're building a lot over there.
And now they're building a new huge manufacturing plant just upstream from Savannah. And I had the number that they are getting the permit, over 200 million a day pumped out of the Savannah River to provide water for that plant.
Is that Lightfoot?
Huh?
Or is that Lightfoot?
No, it's
Fort Wentworth up that area.
It's above what, it's south. Maybe 10, 15 miles south of the river, above Savannah, and I can't remember where it is.
Ryan County.
Yep, it's a huge withdrawal. And we have no relationship, formal legal relationship with Georgia on the management of that resource. And it goes back to the point when Savannah, when Atlanta was running out of water, and their intention was to come to the Savannah and pump water out of the Savannah over the ridge and into the Atlanta watershed. And we came very close to a lawsuit on that. Didn't have to, because ultimately they backed away. When they got rain, they forgot about it. But the issue is there. It's huge with Georgia. We've got to figure out. And this committee deals with two of them, and the Northern Savannah Committee deals with another big piece of it. So that's my perspective.
And this RBC has a draft recommendation about increasing that coordination with Georgia. So when we get to that, we can talk about how we can add more specificity to that recommendation and what we could do to try to address that. Reed, you had a comment?
Yes, it can wait if you want me to, but related to that, I participated Tuesday in that call, the inter-council thing. And while I'm not a scientist and I've only been in South Carolina a dozen years, it was startling to me what they discussed in that call about the chaos is the only word I know to describe what's going on in Georgia. The fact that they have gotten passed in their legislature something called a private city entity, where someone can bypass the municipality if the municipality will not give them what they want as far as water. They can establish themselves a private city, as there was a big fight in Pooler, Georgia about that on this huge development. And a lot of other things talked about their withdrawal, their put back in the river, how it can go at such strong flows in a short period of time. And I don't remember all the discussion, but I felt like, and the topic was brought up, is do we need sometime in one of our meetings for someone who is involved in that over in the state of Georgia to come over and tell us just what's going on over there? Because I'd never heard of a private city, and several others on the call never heard about that. But they evidently got a bill passed in their state legislature that would allow these entities to go around a municipality and dig whatever well they wanted to for their needs down there, was the way it was described to us. And on that call, and that there was, I didn't realize, but the big fight about that, Pooler and others, because certain people had been wanting to get developments done for years that could not, and they found a way to go around the municipalities to do that. So I don't know that, but sometime in the near future, I think it'd be a good idea to have somebody from Georgia to come over and just tell us what was going on there.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that. That could be one of the sooner actions to take in an implementation plan, where we talk about a recommendation of coordinating more with Georgia. Perhaps that's the first step, to just have someone come over and explain.
Good, right along with what Dean said. I didn't know it'd been going on for years, but that's but still it was startling, all on the call that they're doing over there that would affect us.
We attended the Georgia Water Planning, Coastal Water Planning meeting a couple weeks ago, and there was mention about working with South Carolina. So we're ready to contact or have them contact us so that we can start talking about that.
Okay, that's great.
So it was brought up during the coastal.
See, the way you gotta do it, though, is Governor McMaster needs to call the governor of Georgia, and they need to agree that we need to work together. And thereby, the pressure will come down from the governor's office through the state agencies and the legislature on both sides. And everybody will understand that this is a mandate coming from the top. You guys have to sit down together and figure some of this stuff out. Unless we have that, it's just a little back and forth, but it's gotta come from the top. And I would frame the recommendation in the plan in
Yeah.
those terms.
Yeah, I agree.
wholeheartedly agree.
I agree.
That's- We can talk about coordination all we want, but unless the high level people make it happen,
Yeah.
it's not.
Yeah, there was a picture, the old day, there was a picture when Mark Sanford was governor. He and the governor of Georgia were down, this actually dealt with the joint development of the port of Savannah. They were standing down somewhere in just outside Savannah. And they each cut their ties off and gave them to each other so that they would have this partnership. I'm serious. It was back in find pictures. This was probably maybe 89, 88, 89, 90, whenever Mark's.
Yeah, and the reason I brought this up is because I'm a big picture guy. And I wasn't getting the big picture, and I appreciate the comments. So when we go through this, I think we need to filter, coordination with Georgia is more important than low flow toilets or some other things, right?
Yes.
Because we know, one thing I learned is we're leaking half our water out through infrastructure, right? So, I mean, replacing infrastructure is more important than a lot of things, because that's a lot more water supply. So I just want to make sure that we do it. And if you look at the schedule at the end, unfortunately, we don't have much time. We're here. Next meeting, we're finishing some stuff, and then there's May 1st is a draft executive summary, and the plan's pretty much done. Then we're going to the public. So by August, it's done. So we don't have a lot of meetings to meet with George and have all those things unless we do special sessions, which I do go for.
I have a question for Brooke. Brooke,
Yes, ma'am.
when was, if there has ever been, and I'm assuming there has been before, has there been another GPS model done before now of the groundwater? Has there been done one before?
Is there an old one?
Is there an old one?
Yes.
Yeah, there is.
How old is it?
Well, I think there's at least two different ones, at least for this area.
They're not of any use?
And one of them is more related to the saltwater intrusion, and the movement of the plumes. That. I don't know who, I know DHEC supported that effort,
I forget. what it is.
but it was a private contractor for the feedback, know more about that too. And it did it. And
Yeah, Scott, actually, CDM Smith did a groundwater model of the Hilton Head area. And it was specifically geared towards saltwater intrusion. And that was, I don't know, 2005 to 2010. It was a while ago.
and then
It was,
I'm sorry, John.
yeah, it was part of the Coastal Sound Science Initiative.
Yes.
Okay.
And then there's the USGS is, when did they make their first coastal plan around? 2002.
2010 for this area, but they've,
But-
this is the parent model that we're currently recalibrating. They pulled back on the results on that, and there was some poor agreement, with water levels at the coast generally. And so that's what's in calibration and being recalibrated. So
So essentially, we don't have really anything to fall back on or to look back on, before what they're trying to do now.
no, but we are making progress with the USGS contract to get the new model out. So I mean, it's been in the works, but
Right.
behind the scenes.
I just wanted to make sure, I just wanted to know if there was something before, been done before, that we could look back on, but apparently there's not. Okay.
Brooke, can you find out whether the USGS in Georgia has done any modeling of what's happening in the city of Savannah
Mhm.
in terms of,
John, if I'm not mistaken, CDM Smith had done some groundwater modeling in Georgia, is that correct?
Correct. In fact, Georgia EPD is putting out a request for proposals or qualifications sometime in the next 2 or 3 months for groundwater technical support. We have helped Georgia in the past with groundwater technical support, including updating and applying multiple models, including the Coastal Sound Science Initiative model that was saltwater intrusion modeling of the Savannah and Hilton Head area. the work that they're going to be putting in the request for proposals includes update and application of that model, I believe. I haven't seen it yet, but I think that's the expectation. So there may be some modeling that Georgia EPD leads here in the future that updates that Savannah, Hilton Head area model, in addition to other models in the coastal area of Georgia.
And just not to belabor it anymore, but reality, a big picture, reality for, us say on Hilton Head is just a year or so ago, for us to get an increased permit to withdraw from one part of the aquifer, from the brackish part of the aquifer, I had to horse trade with DHAC reduction in permit from the other part of the aquifer. And yes, there's saltwater intrusion, but without sort of a concept of, well, what are the capacities that we're talking about? Because there's treatment technologies, and treatment technologies only advance. And so when we're going to horse trade like that, millions of gallons a day, that's where it's a little concerning that that's our tactic, but we're not basing it on, well, what's actually available and what, So that's.
Maybe you could turn that into a recommendation.
Somehow I will write that.
I just wanted to add something.
Yeah, please.
Based on, really going back to Bill's comments, but it relates to everybody else's comments. There's a lot of uncertainty with what Georgia's going to do, uncertainty in the groundwater because you don't have a modeling tool. But there's also uncertainty in climate. I mean, whether you believe it's natural or anthropogenic, we could have a worse drought start in a couple of years. We don't know. We're assuming that the droughts we've seen in the recent past are the droughts we're going to see in the future in this initial modeling exercise. We may see something worse. We may see our water demand increase a lot more than we think. And so even though we may not see a specific issue now in the Salkehatchie Basin, say, and there's not shortages to address, you still want to think about how can we make our water supplies more resilient, and that should be the focus of the water management strategy conversation. Because it's an uncertain future for a variety of reasons. We're not trying to solve a specific shortage. Let's just think about how we can make our supplies more.
I think another way to say it is, we don't currently see a problem, but we ought to do the best we can.
Yes,
So,
with the caveat that coastal, like Hilton Head and the saltwater is an issue that it's been an issue for a long time.
Could create a problem in the not too distant future.
Could I just add on to the private cities item that Reed mentioned? I was in that interbasin discussion yesterday also. And it goes back, that concept goes back to Florida. And when you pull the string on Florida, it goes back to Orlando. And this small entity that came to Florida about 50 years ago, it's called Disney.
That's right.
And they built a city there called Celebration, which is still there and still very thriving. It was some interesting, unique legislation that enabled Disney to do that the way Disney wanted to do it. And so 50 years later, people are going, aha, maybe I need some of that in Georgia to do what I need in my little city or my development, which I'll declare a private city. Because it won't be connected for water needs to a municipality that exists. But I'm going deep and I now have a new
And you may have
authority.
understood a lot more than I did about that, about the way some of them draw out and dump water in that can raise the river feet in a matter of hours. And some of that that we're doing on the Georgia side, I'm thinking, I just wasn't aware of that and didn't know all of it, but it
So
was.
all of this is very clever, creative, and potentially impactful to all of us here. But it ain't arrived yet. It's, day after tomorrow, maybe, and it's somewhat happening on the Georgia side right now. So,
And the comment was made that by someone said, if you only knew all that was going on the Georgia side.
Yes,
from
they
Savannah. Some person down there made that kind of comment, and that it might not scare somebody, but it should alert somebody.
yes,
Which
That's what I
on
would-
that call.
as well.
And good.
All right, that was a lot of good discussion around the chapter schedule.
I didn't mean to get off track.
No, it was great discussion and it's certainly relevant to what we'll be talking about later with all of the recommendations. So just to recap, some of what I'm hearing come out of this are that you'd like us to send out what we have so far of chapter 5 as soon as possible on the surface water assessment. So you'll have that for review. And then just really making sure in any chapter where discussion of groundwater and the analysis that you've been able to do or not able to do is really discussed to explain that the groundwater model is not available at this time. There's a lot of uncertainty and we'll be able to use it for future plans. So we'll incorporate that language now and please review all of those chapters. We'll note it to you where that's coming out to make sure that you're comfortable with how we're describing that uncertainty. And any limitations of what's actually been done for this analysis. So getting back to the schedule itself, you've received chapters 2 and 8 and comments are due back on that today. I understand that we've heard from some RBC members that you've reviewed the chapter and didn't necessarily have any comments. So just want to make sure that everybody that wants to review those chapters has had a chance.
I sent in, John, just some information from. Because Barnwell has updated our, drought response, so I had sent him the information for that,
We've made that update.
So, other than that, I didn't have anything else. I agree a little bit on the table overload a little bit, but I also understand how much information, sometimes you have to put into the background chapters that some of these are. So, I don't, in some ways, I don't expect a lot of people to read a lot of those. I mean, I skipped over most of those tables just because I can't stand looking at tables and trying to read what it says, read what it is, and then go back to the table a million times. It's too much for my brain to handle. But anyway, I understand that there's a lot of background that you do have to put into what's there, what the area is all about and that type of thing. So I got that. So.
Yeah, and I'm sure John has mentioned it before, and it was mentioned earlier in this meeting that there will be an executive summary to this plan too. And how that's looked for the other river basin plans that have come out so far is about a 30-page document that is much simpler, more visual, more graphics, that really tries to pull out the highlight of each of these chapters. So that's what we expect most people that come to see what the river basin planning is about to read the executive summary, and knowing that all of that detailed technical information is available in the report chapters for whoever wants to see it.
And I'll add too, there's also the option we can prepare a very short 2-page summary, which the Broad, the Saluda, and the Upper Savannah RBC have suggested. And in fact, we've prepared a 2-page summary for all 3 of those. So if you all would like that, we can prepare something like that. So it's kind of an executive summary of the executive summary.
Probably be good too.
Yes.
Yeah, I'd vote for that.
Yeah.
Okay, we will put that on our list to generate.
All right, chapter 3 is the summary of the water resources of the basin. So John sent that out last week, looking at a 2-week period to review that and get comments back to us by the 14th. John mentioned the next chapter that will be coming out is chapter 7. That is the water management strategy recommendation. So everything that you developed at the last meeting. Get that, at the end of this week. The next will be 4 and 6. 4 is the summary of the demands, and 6 is more description of the water management strategies themselves, versus 7 is just talking about which ones you recommended. Then 1 and 9, 1 is just that introduction, and then 9 is all of the other recommendations that you've been developing and will continue today. The planning, the technical, and the policy recommendations. And then 5 and 10, 5 will give you sooner, but make sure we get the full chapter with the groundwater assessment. as well as chapter 10, which is the implementation plan in mid-April. So then you will have received the whole draft plan and hopefully can incorporate all of your comments and come up with a final draft plan by early May.
I have a question for John. This is Ken, John. In table 3.1 of chapter 3, we have this endless table that has ancient data and a lot of NAs in it. What are we trying to show with all those NAs that go on to 5-6 pages?
Yeah, if I recall, I think that's the table listing USGS gauges in both basins. So for this report, it's quite extensive since we're covering both the Salkehatchie and Lower Savannah. I don't recall specifically. I think a lot of the NAs are for specific statistics that there's not information available for. I'd have to go back and look. But we can add a note that explains why there's NAs in there. I don't have it up in front of me right now, but.
You know, a lot of that was almost, I'd say 75% of that stuff was all SRS sites.
Yeah, I think you're right. Mm-hmm.
I'm not sure. I'm not sure it's needed.
Yeah, I'm not sure it's needed either. That was my point. It's just
Okay.
Just when you
Yeah,
go glazes your eyes over and you go, what's this here for if it's not relevant?
Right. We may be able to pull out like a lot of the inactive gauges and just put them in a table in the appendix, perhaps, so it doesn't add extra fluff to the chapter itself.
Great.
Yeah.
Okay, good suggestion.
Any other comments on this or questions?
John, do you need negative reports from those of us that have read it and haven't had a substantive comment? Or is that helpful or not helpful?
Yeah, I'm not sure I follow, John. You said negative reports? You mean just to say that you have no comment or?
Nothing significant to report. Read it.
Yeah, no, it's always nice to know that RBC members reviewed it, and if they don't have comments, I do like to get an email back that says I read it and nothing, jumps out at me. That's helpful. I think it is. Yeah.
Okay.
Right. Anything else? Yeah, Brian.
Say, John, I'll send over our updated information for that table in chapter 8, just as it relates to the Beaufort Jasper water system.
Okay, good. Yeah, if you have an updated drought plan, we'd like to make sure we've got the most current information in there. So thank you.
Okay. All right, so next we're going to get into the discussion of recommendations. I've seen a couple people popping up and down. Do you want to take a quick 5-10 minute break? Yeah. Seeing some nods, yes, okay. Time is it?
11:07.
Okay, want to start again at 11:15? Yeah, all right. Thank you. Okay, 11:17. There's still a couple people out of the room, but we'll get started as everyone rejoins us here. So we are going to get back to our discussion of recommendations. Hopefully wrap this up today. Just finish where we left off last time. We got through the planning process recommendations, had started technical recommendations. So we'll finish those up and then also revisit all of the policy regulatory recommendations that you started back in December. Again, those are just the 3 different types of recommendations that you'll be finishing up. That will go into our chapter 9. So starting with the planning process recommendations, as a quick reminder, this is recommendations related to things like RBC membership and bylaws, ideas to improve communication between the RBC and other groups, funding needs, public engagement and outreach, implementation, and anything else related to the planning process itself. So what we're showing here are the planning process recommendations that you developed and agreed to at the last meeting. So I know not everybody was at the last meeting, so we'll just quickly walk through these, make sure everyone is okay with it. And then there is one discussion point here that's highlighted. So the first recommendation is just to organize an annual state meeting of the RBCs and state agencies. And this is a recommendation that a number of different RBCs have also developed, so it's something that's generally has a lot of support. Any comments on that before moving on? Okay. So number 2 here, the first number 2 was what was developed in the last meeting, so that the legislature should continue to fund state water planning activities, including RBC-based river basin planning. So after the meeting, as we were compiling all of the recommendations that you've developed, you notice that this is kind of an alternative wording of a different policy that you came up with in December. And while they're getting at the same thing, that the river basin planning process should continue, what was discussed in the last meeting mentioned funding specifically, whereas from the conversation back in December, the RBC wanted to leave out the funding piece of it, noting that that's kind of just implied with continuing the planning process itself. So want to see if we can rectify these 2 different versions of number 2 today.
Question.
Yeah,
I have the piece that shows what the Upper Savannah folks said, and what
Yes.
recommended below. I think it's important to both Upper and Lower Savannah say the same thing.
okay.
On this something like this.
Mhm.
Did they approve the language that's shown as in number 2?
Yes, what's shown for the Upper Savannah has been approved by them.
I just think that to the extent these ideas are common, the language should be the same.
I wasn't here last month, so I missed that conversation, but I remember the conversation from December. And I think we talked about that being sort of self-serving, that we talk about the RBC being funded versus water plan be funded at the basin level. That was the reason why we backed off of it. Because if I were reading it as someone in a state agency, I might think, oh, their number 2 recommendation is we keep funding them. You know, so I think that's why we backed off of it, but I wasn't here last month, so I don't know how we went backwards.
Question, Scott. Water SC, is it taking over the roles of the RBC? What's the plan for that, and how's that gonna, because that affects what this is, right?
The water SC, right now, I think is, it's not a permanent group. It may turn into one, I don't know, but right now I don't think it is, and it's made, it has a couple remaining tasks. And that is to report to the Surface Water Study Committee, Legislative Committee, on any recommendations, I think regarding water law, water regulation. Then their other task is to serve as in an advisory capacity on the development of the water plan, which is starting to be written and coming together, and that has to be done by the end of the year. What happens with Water SC after that is unknown. I don't know. I don't know if Joe Coon is on, if he could weigh in.
They had to go to a different meeting.
Okay.
He and me and both.
So I don't think that's the plan for them to take over the river basin councils, but I don't know what the long-term plan for the water SC is at this. I'm not sure. I'm not sure who knows. Maybe somebody does.
Yeah, we have to remember that the river basin councils were a creation of the Department of Natural Resources. They weren't legislatively created. There's no state law that creates us. Transfer to DES. Which, you know, may or may not be willing to. We just don't know from a state level what the future of these of this are. We know what we want the future to be. And what the water plan that we did, or the advisory project we did, says it should be. This is South Carolina. I have no idea.
To your point, the General Assembly agreed and acted on funding to get these going.
That's right. That's true.
That's not a trivial point.
No, it is trivial.
You may be 100% correct that it's really the staff that's created this, but the assembly acted to put money into the process, so. It is South Carolina.
Yeah, Sarah?
Like Bill, I wasn't here last week, so I don't know how we got to what is not italicized there. I still prefer the language and the italicized bit for number 2, just because it doesn't sound as self-serving. You know. Not against adding something there stating that funding should be provided, not necessarily saying give us money, but and funds should be available to do so. Or funds should be made available to do so. But
To do what and how often? No, but that's.
I get it, yeah.
We meet
yeah.
again and
You got
after the groundwater comes out, I mean, what's the
Water,
next?
water planning at the river basin level. That's what it says. I think that's what
Yeah,
the
it's-
funding is for. Water planning at the river basin level, which we are the perfect tool to do that, but we don't have to be.
Well, if you just stuck it right there at the end of that italicized sentence, and funding should be made available to do so, because South Carolina is growing rapidly, demand for water increasing, and water resources are finite. Water planning at river basin and state level should continue, and funding should be made available to do so. It's at the state level. Planning river basin, I mean, it says right there that.
I don't care for the alternate. I'd rather just go back to number 2. It just simplifies it and says it, states it.
And I'm good with that too. Just my preference,
That was the consensus in the meeting yesterday with the applicants.
I just think it needs to be simplified.
Yeah, I think the origin of the number 2 from the last meeting was coming from looking at the recommendations that other RBCs have developed, and a lot of them had something that was really similar to the number 2 that's there. But yeah, that was getting away from the discussion.
And I'm good with that. I don't, like I said, I wasn't here, so I don't want to relitigate something that was already,
I can accept it as well, though.
Yeah.
I don't mind.
I'm good with it.
But that's the,
Number 2, regular number 2, without the. Well, yeah.
is there anyone that could not accept number 2?
Well, but I don't mind.
So moved, let's go, just move on.
Move on. All right,
Start looking at it.
Tired of looking at it. Let's move on.
Yeah, we can move along.
okay, so the next were about communicating with the legislative delegation throughout the planning process to promote familiarity. That's come up in a number of RBCs as well. Support education and outreach, designate staff to coordinate and support the RBC activities. It's kind of supporting number 2. Request that Water SC consider the recommendations from the RBCs. Conduct regular reviews of the membership to make sure that all interest categories are represented, another common one. And then number 8 here, the RBC with support of SCDES should communicate with Georgia DEP and request to coordinate water planning activities with the Coastal Georgia Regional Council. So-
Up to number 2.
Yeah, so another piece of this, when we get to the implementation plan, that's when the RBC can prioritize all of the recommendations and the strategies. So hearing about the Georgia coordination is definitely going to be a high priority for this RBC. But just for now, to get the recommendation approved, is there anything you want to add to that Georgia Council one? Or just wait till we get to the implementation plan where you can talk about specifics of what that would actually look like?
Think we can get.
I'm
into
not sure the RBC is the one to do it. I think the state, I think it needs to be a recommendation that says, the state should formally create a relationship or create a formal relationship with Georgia managing water planning in the Savannah River Basin. I mean,
Yeah, the RBC has.
you gotta be
no power.
you gotta be specific.
Yeah,
about it.
you're right.
Yeah,
I think that has to come first, but then we still have to coordinate.
Sure.
yeah, is there any value in having 2 recommendations about it? One, working within the existing RBC process to have that coordination, and then a second one, looking for some type of coordination at a higher level.
Yes.
Okay, so keep 8 as we have it, and then get into the higher level one when we get to policy.
Back to number 3,
Yeah,
should communicate. What are we gonna tell our legislative delegations? What's the message? I mean, we throw stuff out there. I mean, Is there a mixed message that each one of us calls a different legislator, and what do we tell them? We're going through a planning process and you need to make sure low flow toilets are installed in your area, or
Yeah,
what do we say? There's gotta be, you can't just do that without a direct message.
right. So I think all of those details are what would then come into first the implementation plan and then actually following through on it. So where this was a recommendation previously, I think it first came in from the Edisto. And then they talked about the importance of making sure they had consistent messaging. So maybe developing a list of talking points and then keeping track of who's talking to who. So yeah, there's more opportunity for getting into specifics on that.
Right.
Right. All right, any other comments on these recommendations? Okay, just going to quickly move over and go back to the IRC meeting. I mentioned that there was some discussion of whether there are opportunities to make similar recommendations to what the Upper Savannah has done. So there are two related to the planning process that we want to quickly talk about. So the first here in green, which you probably can't read if you're in the room. Okay, so that's actually about increasing coordination with Georgia. So in the IRC meeting.
Is there a different slide on that? It's not in the slide setup?
Yeah, sorry, this is not in the slide. I think John might have sent this as a separate attachment.
What's it called?
Yeah, it was sent out separately.
LSS implementation table?
No, not the implementation table. I think it might have been.
It's a recommendation, something recommendation.
Yeah.
USLSS recommendations.
Here.
So the Upper Savannah had said increased coordination and planning with Georgia DP on Savannah River water resources issues, and
this afternoon on
the Lower Savannah, you had the recommendation that we just went over of coordinating with DEP and requesting to coordinate with the Coastal Georgia Regional Council. So in the IRC meeting, we talked about whether there's opportunity to get into any more specifics on that. And it was suggested that we state that coordination should happen at least once a year. Are you okay with adding this bolded text recommendation that would add a little bit more specificity? Do you want to suggest it happens more than once a year, or just leave it as it was? But we are going to also go back.
I would leave it as it was, and then we get into specifics in the more in the details of the recommendation plan.
Okay. Yeah, from the IRC meeting, we're also going to go back to the full Upper Savannah RBC to see if they also wanted to add in some additional specificity to it.
I mean, what John sent out doesn't have that on. It's yellow. So that green's new. I can't read it.
Okay.
I can't read it either.
Yeah, so the new text.
We don't have.
Who other planning bodies are, that's what I'm curious about.
Yeah.
That's so broad, what does that even mean?
Actually, you could read that on a press.
So what it says is that meetings with other planning bodies in the Savannah River Basin should occur annually at a minimum. So we were originally just saying that the RBC should communicate with the Georgia side. But now we're saying that should happen at least once a year. That's the difference.
But what is there?
Sorry, I was gonna say the other planning bodies refer to the Upper Savannah RBC, the Savannah Upper Ogeechee Regional Council on the Georgia side, and then the Coastal Georgia Regional Council on the Georgia side. So 4 different planning bodies across the entire Savannah Basin.
And I think we should say water resources planning bodies. If we're
Yeah, that's a good point.
I thought it was so broad, yeah.
John, correct me if I'm misstating this, but didn't Harry in yesterday's meeting cite decades of fitful start and stops of this type of coordination with organizations that no longer exist, that were stood up 1 meeting, 2 meetings, and then they went away?
Yes, that's an accurate statement. Yep.
And then this wording came out of that discussion of the fitfulness of the past to say, let's get one specificity in here, one item that should happen going forward. So that's all that we were trying to do yesterday with this.
Yeah, thanks for
Right.
that. Is anyone not okay with adding this?
I'm okay with it, but unless there's a outreach, I mean, I've dealt with a lot of this in California, inter service stuff in the military, unless there's outreach at the top.
Mm-hmm.
All this can happen and I can call somebody over there, but it really doesn't mean anything.
Yeah.
It's just, you're just exploring something. So if we really want, you know, to make a high level recommendation, it would be what Dean said, it would be a governor to governor compact,
Mm-hmm.
like other states have done. I know California, et cetera, about water. How are we gonna manage this resource jointly? I don't think it can be done any other way politically than, otherwise we're just, yeah, we can have meetings and we can talk, but nothing will happen.
Or it could settle in court like Alabama, Georgia, and Florida. So,
Or South Carolina, North Carolina,
Yeah.
when McMaster was Attorney General and sued North Carolina.
North Carolina, Virginia is another one.
Yeah.
Virginia Beach.
They have a standing group in the Catawba, I think, between the two states. So it's not, we're not asking for something.
There is a precedent. Yes.
Okay. So we had talked before about if we can go ahead and keep this planning recommendation that the RBC will do some coordination, but then also have a bigger picture governor to governor recommendation later. If it's okay, we can move ahead. If nobody objects to this, say that we will add that additional specificity about at least one annual meeting. Wrap up our planning process recommendations and then shortly get into the policy recommendation. Talk more about the higher level. Okay. All right, so that wraps up what's been developed so far for planning process recommendations. Does anyone have anything else that they want to add to this? All right.
Grace, there was one more, I think, that the IRC considered at the bottom of that spreadsheet having to do with increasing engagement with the Army Corps of Engineers. Yeah, that one highlighted green there.
Yes, so
That makes sense for the upper basin, that affects us, but the upper basin, that seems more critical. But it affects, right?
It's a flow issue.
It is.
And volume of flow at times. So the point was that the lower is affected, but less directly, if you will.
So in my,
The upper.
I understand it, and I don't disagree with it, but I actually, my brain is thinking higher than that. I think there's a coordination with the federal government. Savannah Riverside's 1% of the land area of South Carolina, and they are permitted for a large amount that they're not taking. But they don't have to ask us, do they? No. There's a coordination with the federal government almost as much as there is with Georgia, the Army Corps and Department of Energy. So I think, in my mind, I was thinking higher than this. That really affects them.
My mind doesn't go higher than the Army Corps.
So there's two parts of the federal government, I think, that ought to have a better interface. So I'm okay with this, but my brain is just thinking more interface with the federal government.
So what if we added to the Laura Savannah's recommendation that as part of future water planning efforts, RBC should attempt to increase engagement with the Army Corps, and specifically the Planning Division, as well as the Department of Energy?
Yes.
Yeah, I'm okay. Great. Yeah.
okay, seems like there's some agreement on that one. Is anyone against this one? Okay. Then we are done with the planning process recommendations. So that's great. We can check that one off.
You should have been on that.
So next, we'll go to the technical and program recommendations. This is where you left off at the last meeting. So again, this is where you might have any recommendations related to the need for more data, any kind of additional study. requests for additional modeling analysis. So this is where you can get into any groundwater related recommendations. I believe there's some already on that, but can see what else you want to add today. Okay, so this is what was agreed to last time in the green buckets. So this is how you had worded actually number 1 there of the groundwater model. So DES should continue to work with USGS to develop a groundwater model covering the lower Savannah-Salkehatchie basins and use the model to better understand the capacity of each aquifer. Does that encompass what you think it needs to? Is there anything that needs to be added to the recommendation itself, recognizing that in the implementation plan, we'll talk more about the specifics of how to do it?
Yeah, versus demand, I would think, capacity versus demand.
Yes, yeah, I'm just thinking whether that is kind of implicit and then using the model the next part of the planning process. But if you want to add some language about to better understand the capacity of the each aquifer and its abilities to meet projected demands, you could add some language like that.
Well, at this point, we don't even know that it's how it is affected by the current demands.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not just the projected demands, but current demands.
Yeah,
at this
good point.
So, you know,
Well, we have some groundwater level information that gives you current conditions.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but typically would use the model too to do like a current conditions.
Right, but you would be calibrating the model to current conditions.
Sorry, well,
Be calibrating the model to current conditions.
yeah. Use the model to better understand the capacity of each aquifer and its ability to meet demands, to sustain demands.
Future demands.
So,
You know, it's meeting current demands.
mhm. Or like the impacts of
Sustain
current.
future demands.
Is everyone okay with that wording? Anyone opposed? Okay. All right, then I'm gonna skip over 2 for now. RBC supports continuing to maintain and expand stream flow gauges. Mentioning that future plan modeling should incorporate scenarios that look at future uncertainties. Future planning efforts should include evaluation of surface water quality and trends. And then funding be provided to DES to add monitoring wells to the central part of the basin and deeper aquifers. So Brooke had sent some graphics for us to look at related to this number 6, but before we get to that, anyone have comments on 3, 4, or 5? Okay.
I would suggest that we cluster these together so that the surface water recommendations are together and the groundwater recommendations are together,
Okay,
rather than splitting them up.
that makes sense. Okay, Brooke, if I pull up the graphic you sent, do you want to speak to that?
Sure, let's do it. Let's see.
Come on up.
I can't see it.
You're welcome to sit here too.
All right, so, well, I'm gonna come up here. Okay, so what I've shared, I've got Crouch Branch and McQueen Branch. These are the 2 aquifers that we have the most uncertainty in. The upper Florida and middle Florida and Gordon, we've got a wide range of wells. We have not seen a lot of changes in those, with the exception of the upper Florida aquifer, which we've discussed a lot. But we have plenty of wells to characterize that cone, track that cone. These are 2 images that I showed about a year ago. So these are the potentiometric contours from our most recent mapping efforts. And the darker dots here are the locations within, I'll start on the side first of the Crouch Branch, the locations where we have production wells, regardless of water use, that are tapped into the Crouch Branch, cross tapped into the Crouch Branch Queen Branch, or cross tapped into the Crouch Branch Gordon. So I didn't differentiate for those because we would have to really sit down and figure out exactly where the water is coming from, but if it's tapped into the aquifer, I consider it in that aquifer. So the red circles here are the locations where we have our continuously monitoring wells. We've looked at data from these wells. These are our best sites. They do have a varying range of period of record, but we have installed in those wells a probe that has been monitoring on hourly, and we can look at trends there. Then these smaller diamonds that I'm showing, they also end up, they're coincident with some of the some of the red dots as well. Those are our potentiometric water level locations where we are collecting data periodically, usually on a 3-year cycle to determine data points so that we can interpolate to make these contour lines. So the solid contour lines are where we have pretty good information, but then we have these dashed lines where we're inferring water levels. So what I see in these and what we're trying to get at is what would be good locations and where are we lacking data for the Crouch Branch. We've got some water use that's occurring in Hampton County, but we don't have any monitoring stations there. We also have some sites in Colleton County and Salkehatchie. We only have one monitoring station there, and it's not enough to characterize that area. There are really no wells that are pumping down in Jasper and Beaufort because Crouch Branch, less productive down there. Also, very, very expensive and deep to drill. So as going for recommendations of where we would place Crouch Branch well, I would say that we need some in the Colleton and Hampton and Bamberg area so that we can characterize some of the agricultural withdrawals. That's largely there. Now, Mr. Oswald, who has graciously offered to let us come on his property and see what wells could be usable there. That's an option. I know that he's got some Crouch Branch wells, and so that's something that we're going to look into. But as far as making recommendations, it's this River Basin Council drilling in the Hampton, Northern Colleton, and Southern Bamberg area would be a recommendation based upon what we're seeing here. Now, that's not to say that even we haven't seen a ton of declines over the years looking at these maps. And so that gets at, we have been able to sustain water levels over time, even with the water use that has occurred in the past. Okay, so McQueen Branch, Charleston, same kind of situation here where I've got pumping wells. We have far less production wells put into the McQueen Branch in Charleston because it's very deep in this region, but same kind of situation. I would suggest that we get some more in Colleton. We've got one here in Jasper. We do have a good well down here. So more monitoring in Colleton County or Southern Bamberg County. So that's kind of like for recommendations. They're both in the same location, but that's what I would recommend at this point of where we need more monitoring. So, yeah.
Is Central Park too generic for what you just said, or should we be more specific?
So the issue with siting groundwater wells is that we need public land and then we need permission. So for right now, to not put any kind of constraints on where we want to drill, I would say that within the central region of Bamberg County, northern portion of Colleton County. Yeah, it's very. It's time consuming and a process to find somewhere that wants to let us drill. We have good luck at schools, baseball, recreation complexes, but we
Typically have to get approval.
We've got to get approval. We've got to usually go to the
Like that.
the county. We got to go to the councils and get it and give presentations. And we're currently doing that in Lexington right now, and so hopefully we'll have some wells in Lexington County. That was a recommendation out of the Ediso plan. We're moving forward through it. So we would anticipate doing the same type of process. Or if we can identify wells that are production wells that we could get more information of. That the issue with using production wells is that they do go into production. And so we don't get that continuous record as if it was a monitoring well, and we can't kind of get an ambient baseline condition around theirs would be subject to seeing, the pumping.
But I agree with Ken, we were very specific on where we wanted Carlton, Bamberg and Hampton, you said for the Queen Branch, so Central was maybe too broad, is that what you're saying, Ken?
Yeah, I just said,
Say where we want them.
instead of central one, we just say, you just,
Oh, I wasn't looking at the words. I'm sorry. Okay,
another question.
yes, sir.
How do you do a groundwater study without what monitoring wells? How are they gonna do that? What method do they use if they don't have wells to monitor?
For the USGS.
Yeah,
The USGS is gonna use the pumping wells and then they're gonna calibrate with any old water levels that are available there, yeah. So there's uncertainty involved in the modeling.
Yeah, we use whatever water level data is available to get the best calibration we can.
Now, yeah, so there's uncertainty in it, of course.
More wells would help.
More wells would help, but in some of these locations, especially when you get closer to the coast, the uppermost aquifers are utilized because there's enough water, it's cheaper to drill, and so there's no point in drilling deeper. At least there wasn't, you know, and if there's water available there of good quality and abundant quality of the aquifer is very transmissive, so that's part of the reason why there are less wells and less information in those portions of the state.
Did your map show the hot map wells?
Yes,
It did show.
yeah, so, yeah, if we were in a different part of the state, you know, there would be, you know, far more Crouch Branch and Queen Branch. It's just this area of the state, because the upper Florida and middle Florida and Gordon aquifers are productive, those were the ones that were more often.
Crouch, Bug and Queen Lower.
Yes, yes.
So does the RBC want to add more specificity to the central part of the basin to maybe say the specific counties and aquifers that Brooke mentioned, or just specific counties and leave it as deeper aquifers? Anyone have a recommendation for how to make this a bit more specific?
I think we should mention the counties.
Okay. So that was such as Colleton, Bamberg. What was Hampton? And do you want to leave it as just in the deeper aquifers?
Yeah, I think that makes sense.
Okay. All right. Great. So those were the technical recommendations discussed last time. We did have a yellow bucket for one of these, which was the discussion of the index of biotic integrity. That was from Larry. Is Larry online?
Larry Hayden, yes, he is.
Yeah, I'm online. Yeah, I've had some discussions with Luke Bauer. He said it's pretty difficult to do IBI, and that's why they didn't calculate anything for this plan right now. He has made some other recommendations, but I'm still going through some of the research to figure out what he's asking for. So I don't have anything new to add to this. For right now, I don't think we should put it in. For
Okay.
right.
agree.
Okay.
Bucket is.
Yeah. I don't have a red bucket handy. Oh wait, here's one.
That one in the truck.
There you go. Okay. Then coming out of the IRC, I believe we had some additional technical recommendations that were discussed that when looking at what the Upper Savannah had, the members of the Lower Savannah-Salkehatchie that were on, Reed or John, thought it was worthy of bringing some of these recommendations to the full RBC. So those are what we'll see here in green. And again, I will read them to you. So the first one is that the state should request for and cost share in the completion of phase 2 of the Army Corps' comprehensive study and the drought plan update. So that was the study that was going to have the Army Corps revisit their original drought plan. It stopped a few years ago due to lack of funding, inability to find consensus. And the Upper Savannah thought it was worthwhile to include a recommendation stating that that should be completed. So does this RBC agree that that's worth stating. And Reed and John, please feel free to add any more information on the discussion from your point of view.
I just thought it made eminent sense, this would be supporting and supportive of their position on this.
Sounds
And
important, yeah.
that there would be benefits all the way down through both basins. And this came out of Harry's background. So he started the side chapter and verse of date and place where it had been dead ended, and how the need was there to restart and continue the planning. And the Army Corps is a wonderful organization. They're gargantuan in size. So, and they're not adequately funded to meet all things. So this is just our way of saying, yes, please restart this part of the planning process from the Corps standpoint.
I move we add it. I'm okay with it.
All right, anyone opposed to this recommendation? Okay. We'll incorporate that one. The next.
Grace, I was just going to add to that, both Georgia and South Carolina kicked in funding for phase 2, but the Nature Conservancy was a significant contributor to the study as well, as maybe were some other agencies. I just wanted to point that out.
Thank you. Okay, so the next recommendation was that the RBC encourages local governments and land managers to act to reduce sediment loading to reservoirs.
I think this one's a little unusual since none of the local governments are in our basin. There are no reservoirs in our basin.
Yeah, we don't have any reservoirs in our.
So yeah, it may make sense, but we have no influence over those local governments. So I'm not sure that it's appropriate for us.
The only counter argument to that would be that we depend on the storage in those reservoirs, just like everybody else does, and to the extent you're filling those reservoirs with sediment, it works to our disadvantage in the long term.
I absolutely agree with you from the technical standpoint, but I think that's their job to support. And maybe we could copy all of their recommendations because they probably have an impact on us as well. But since we have no real connection to any other local governments that provide sediment to the basin, I'm not sure.
And part of this discussion was state requirements and EPA requirements versus local requirements, and specifically on construction activities. It wasn't focused on the Army Corps and the big reservoirs there, but more, as I understood the discussion, was more on the local community level with smaller impoundment areas that silt up as a result of lax enforcement of the rules on erosion activities around these construction sites.
That makes sense to me, but not with this statement. This one sounds like the big reservoirs.
Yeah, this just.
Can we clarify it?
Yeah, do you want to change the wording to reservoirs and small impoundments, or just to small impoundments or impoundments?
That would be fine with me, and I'm a hostage to my experience. So Aiken County's got a bunch of these. They're not what the Army Corps is concerned with per se, but they're related in some cases to high hazard dams.
Yeah, I live near one.
Okay, you can live that too. So if it's not clear enough, let's try to make it a little clearer. So it's not related to.
My first assumption was the 3 big lakes.
Opposed to impoundments. Or water bodies, surface water bodies.
A water retention area.
So people who work with
Impoundment
local governments, how would you
retention.
word it to where it made sense? How would you word it? What would make sense that you would communicate to a local government?
That could be confusing things, but I mean, a lot of our municipal governments now, I think, are on like the like the stormwater runoff management front. They're having to hold MS4 permits, NPDES permits. So that has its whole own world of regulatory requirements, and I'm not sure what Sounds like we're just tossing another task.
I mean, we've got,
Overburdened.
Well, it was
yeah, I mean,
it was a statement of a problem that may or may not exist. I mean, quite frankly, the way it came up.
I mean, you've got small impoundments, but those are stormwater runoffs you've gotta have. You've gotta have those, so. Sediment's gonna end up being there anyway, just, there's not a whole lot you can do about that in a lot of locations, you just, I don't know, I'm just not.
If nobody feels strongly about it, we don't have to have a recommendation around this. I think some of the discussion, to your point, Pete, was that local governments could have more stringent requirements than what's already required.
Or better enforcement of the existing requirements.
Hey, just as an example, I think Jeff Phillips from the Upper Savannah RBC mentioned during the IRC call that one example would be Greenville County's recent change in their stream buffer ordinance. They created a buffer requirement. I can't remember if it's now 50 feet or 100 feet, but it's stricter than what the state requires. So he just highlighted that as an example of something that helps reduce erosion to get into streams that would then feed into reservoirs or impoundments.
Because you could caveat it more like after the word act, act as they deem necessary to reduce.
I don't think that's necessary.
Does anyone
we're
feel
just gonna-
strongly about this one?
Put that over on the side.
Okay,
We can come back and talk again.
okay.
Maybe a yellow bar.
Yeah. And then the third one coming out of the IRC was to encourage the building permitting process where applicable to require developers to work with water and wastewater utilities to ensure adequate availability and capacity. And the Upper Savannah made this recommendation. I forget if another river basin council did as well. But there's been a lot of discussion when it has come up about whether or not this happens already. Some people have experience with it happening and others cite experience where it hasn't happened. So is this something that is a concern to the Lower Savannah-Salkehatchie RBC?
It makes sense, right?
Well, it does, to me, from our standpoint, it already happened, so I don't know.
Let me give you an example of a recent one. So in Aiken, the county is responsible for water treatment. The city provides fresh water. And a plant was wanted to come into the edge of Aiken. City council voted not unanimously, but almost unanimously to support it. And the county council came to think about it and realized when the staff came in, there is zero capacity left. Zero! You've already given it away. And it's going to be a minimum of 5 years. So county council voted against it. And in the comments, the county administrator said, basically, this has a ghost of a chance of ever coming back. It's dead as the ghost. So this is a very painful recent example of a well-intended economic activity that was not based on reality. There wasn't enough water there. It wouldn't be for some number of years.
Yeah.
So
Wasn't enough water or enough wastewater treatment?
wastewater treatment capacity, but there was a negative opinion in city council that there wasn't the water there either. That never really got vetted. But it was the wastewater treatment that then came to be.
That wastewater plant on the Savannah that Aiken County owns is at capacity.
They are permitted at capacity like in the next 2 years. primarily with residential development. And this was commercial. So, and county council didn't realize it.
Sounds to me like somebody ought to get fired.
Oh, well, so that was the genesis here for stating what should have been the.
That's the type of, I mean, that's just the type of thing that's or non-communication. Large county.
Just I was thinking nomenclature, but Bill, this capacity permitting of wastewater and water is my experience, that's a separate thing for new development versus building permits.
Yeah, that is. It's
Just
totally
that
different.
terminology, building permit is not.
Yeah,
It's just the development permitting itself.
economic development. Completely. I mean, yeah.
Yeah, what is the permitting process that it would be if not building?
It's not new development because it's,
Yeah.
yeah.
Okay, everyone okay with this as written?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah. All right, so those were the 3 recommendations coming out of the IRC. Scott, is lunch here?
It is here.
Okay. All right, well then, let's take a break, have everyone get some lunch, and then come back and continue our discussion.
Usually about 25 minutes, that'll be
25
12:30.
Okay, all right, come back at 12:30.
For the record, the name of the ghost is Marley's Ghost, is what he was calling out. That is Marley's Ghost.
Oh, this is. Record and we're good to go.
All right, 12:30, we'll get back from lunch, pick up where we left off with our recommendations. So we had gotten through the technical recommendations that came out of the IRC earlier this week. And to wrap up the technical recommendations, we just want to touch on a few different discussions that have come up in past meetings and see if anyone feels strongly to make a recommendation around it. So the first one here was about groundwater modeling analyses of high demands in the coastal portion of the basin. There were some discussions at the last meeting, and probably before, just about the impacts of high demands and specifically irrigation demands in coastal areas and the growth in these areas. So does anyone have a specific recommendation they want to make around this related to technical analysis that could be done in future planning meetings? We have the recommendation on the development of the groundwater model, to use the model to better understand the capacity of each aquifer and to its ability to sustain future demands. Do you want to say anything about specific modeling scenarios that should be done, or okay to just leave it as the analysis of supply and demand?
Should we have, can we say, continued saltwater intrusion based upper Florida. I guess upper Florida and middle Florida aquifers.
So upper Florida, sorry, can you say that again?
Upper Florida and middle Florida aquifers and you take out that coastal portion, you'd be more specific now.
Yeah. So, plus the groundwater or the groundwater model should be used
To analyze saltwater intrusion. That would take out that high demand.
Yeah.
Stuff.
Okay.
Yep.
Is everyone okay with that? Anyone opposed?
I'd add one more word,
Okay,
analyze and predict
okay.
saltwater.
Everyone okay with that addition?
Hey, Grace, I might point one thing out. The model that the USGS has developed of the entire coastal plain, it's not a dual density model. So inherently, it can't look at saltwater migration. Groundwater models that are dual density models, can look at the difference in migration. They have a freshwater barrier, a freshwater portion, a saltwater portion. So like the coastal sound science model I mentioned was done with the dual density model, the Georgia side, and includes part of Hilton Head. My understanding would be that it would require development of a specific dual density model if you wanted to look at saltwater intrusion. A regular groundwater model with, the contaminant transport part can look at particle tracking, so they can look at like upconing, and look at particles as they move, but not the interaction between salt and freshwater. So you couldn't really predict how the saltwater front might migrate forward or backward under different conditions.
Kind of modeling we've done shows potentials like related to the pluming of the saltwater and the freshwater part. So maybe it's even just better, instead of the word saltwater intrusion, maybe just say chloride levels. And then you're hitting.
Does that jive with the capabilities of the groundwater model?
I'm not sure, Grace.
Yeah.
I feel like, and I apologize, this goes back in my early part of my career when I worked and lived on Long Island, and I was doing both freshwater and saltwater modeling of the major aquifers across Long Island, New York. And we had different models. When we would try to determine chloride levels, I believe we were using the dual density model. But that's going back.
Are you saying that you put in like a plume that represents the chloride concentrations and then see?
The plumes are known.
Mhm.
So, it's kind of, because saltwater, on Hilton Head at least, the saltwater comes at us from all angles.
Mhm.
So there's a front, if you will, like from the sound. Then there's upcoming pluming of it as well. And the plumes are mapped. And then we've done like modeling where it's just advancing the what they think the chloride will look like around the plumes as you advance 10 years, 20 years, 30 years.
Okay, so it's just like transport modeling.
Yeah. And my comment's getting too into the weeds. I think the recommendation is still applicable. I just wanted to kind of not over promise in that the existing model that the USGS has might not be the most appropriate model to answer all the questions that are needed, but I certainly think it can do some of what Pete's suggesting.
Yeah, and maybe just like combine with other types of analysis too, like if the groundwater model can get to drawdown and contour levels, how could that be combined?
I also think we should acknowledge that the groundwater modeling process will be continued. In other words, that those models will be refined, will be developed, they'll be improved, they'll be changed. So to the extent that's an objective, then that it seems to me that's an encouragement for the state and USGS to create, help us make those analyses.
So we have this recommendation at the top here already, to continue to work with USGS to develop a groundwater model. So this is just, yeah, requesting another use of that model. Okay, everyone okay with how this is written now? Can add some description of the discussion when we actually put it in the plan. Okay, the next was, there was some discussion of where ASR has been implemented in the state already and just how it hasn't quite panned out exactly as expected in some instances. And perhaps it would be useful for there to be some type of study on where there is greater potential for ASR throughout the basin. Is that a recommendation that anyone feels strongly about to make?
Anybody think of another place where it's applicable? Where,
I mean, yeah, it could be done, I would imagine all throughout the basin, just based on if the aquifer is suitable for it. Which my understanding is we have, I was just talking to our one hydrogeologist, late last week, and he said, like, for example, like in Orangeburg, they have good ASR potential, and it's a good spot for it.
so I just imagine we have the river water, maybe in the future, but I can't even see a.
Oh, is there a need for it? Yeah, no, that's a whole other, yeah.
That's.
Yeah.
To each pay study, I really recommend that. That's all. I mean, is that I think it's amazing what you've done. I really was amazed when I saw it, but I'm not sure I could imagine that anywhere else on the basin.
So it could be a recommendation that you give a low priority to, or you could decide that it's not important enough at this point to be included as a specific
I'm
recommendation.
just worried it dilutes our other recommendations.
Mhm.
So that's.
You know, it's a drought. I guess the place would be surface water dependent. It would be a drought technique, strategy. They recharge it with their treated surface water, and then if they get into a drought situation, the ASR would be there. So things like that.
I will mention that in chapter 7, which you're going to get tomorrow, there's a final section on adaptive management. And we talk about a number of strategies that, while might not be necessary or recommended throughout the basin, could be needed. And this is a good example of one of them. If conditions change and it looks like there's more need for ASR because of longer extended droughts and higher demands than expected, then that's when it might be useful. So we do certainly mention it in the context of a future strategy that could be employed, not just in the coastal area like it already is, but in other parts of the basin. So it's kind of in your back pocket strategy, that could be there and expanded. And I guess because of that, I'm suggesting maybe you don't need a recommendation. It's noted in the adaptive management discussion of chapter 7.
So this is one of the things that I've not really commented much in the past, but as a person who spends time on the river, it varies 18 feet during the year. And so I'll be fishing one day in one spot and there are no fish there because the river is flooded by 18 feet. And so there's always water in the river, and sometimes way too much. And I've all just think, well, capturing that flood. But would I capture it in would I capture it in the aquifer, or would I capture it in a tank or a basin or some other? I think the aquifer seems like not the smartest place to store the flood. It seems like an awful hard way to do it.
You gotta treat it. I mean, I would assume you're talking about treated water.
And so that's so I would think before I would recommend an ASR in the other parts of the basin, I would capture the flood for saving. That's what the ASR does. So isn't it the same thing? Capturing the good times
Another reservoir, another reservoir, is that what you're saying?
Huh?
You're recommending another reservoir?
That could be a lot more expensive than the ASR.
But they last a long time. There's a lot of locations beside the river where nobody lives between Augusta and Savannah. I just want to see that. I see a reservoir as an easier, smarter solution. But I don't think I would not recommend it. That's why I haven't said that before. But I would recommend that before I would recommend ASR throughout the basin. That's my thought.
I think we put that in the yellow.
Okay, you want to revisit it, or like John said, we mention it as an adaptive management strategy in chapter 7.
That makes sense.
Yeah,
I'll
okay.
what he said.
All right, so we'll talk about it in chapter 7.
Big red question. No,
Big no. Okay, another concept that was discussed was the creation of a groundwater barrier via injected treated wastewater effluent that would help prevent saltwater intrusion.
We just changed that to say recycled water.
Sure.
Yeah,
Because, you know, we kind of.
They're the same thing, we're hiding it? Is what-
So we eliminated that term nationally about 1989. So South Carolina's 2025, it's only, 35 years behind.
I think the reason they changed it, because people can't stomach one.
Well, you drink sodas, right? They're out of recycled aluminum cans that have been, with all kinds of maggots, right? They're recycled, they're processed, you still drink them.
I want to recycle nuclear waste, but nobody else wants to, so, but, we can talk about recycling all we want, but I don't like this, one, so, but I'm not gonna follow my sword over.
Well, let me make a comment. I mean, it's being used throughout the United States to help stop saltwater. It needs to be studied and there needs to be a regulatory changes if it can be implemented.
Well, the study is different than saying create.
Well, you can't create it because it's not, you're not allowed to right now.
That's why I don't like this.
I'd say study.
Yeah.
Study the use of recycled water as a groundwater barrier to prevent saltwater intrusion.
Should we put a responsibility on someone to do that?
Oh,
Could we say that DES should study?
Yeah.
Or something like that? I mean, be specific about. Where
Yeah,
you see the responsibility.
If someone call 911, like, that's never gonna happen. Yeah. Makes sense to.
Well, then I guess on number one, who does the groundwater model,
Exactly.
right? So it's the same thing throughout.
Yeah.
So I yes.
Yeah, and different river basin councils have done this different ways, whether they just say what should happen and then in the implementation plan can get into who does it, but it certainly doesn't hurt to clarify in the recommendation who's doing it too. So want to put USGS there?
I think we're a lot closer and you're back up on number one.
I just
sorry,
moved up to
USGS.
trying to identify
In number three, you could have a comma after intrusion. I think you could simplify number three a lot and just say, should study the use of indirect potable reuse.
That's a little different game.
just broader.
It's just broader, but indirect, that indirect potable is the same as if it's. Saltwater barrier would be something that you could do if you have the indirect potable, just like groundwater recharge is something you could do if you have the indirect potable. You can't do either of those things unless you're talking about the indirect potable.
So you could simplify it as
Treated it now.
indirect potable reuse and then could include in the discussion some examples, what that would allow.
Yeah, that's just. We're gonna take it to
Okay.
South Carolina's not gonna touch it unless we treat it into a drinking water standard.
So we treat it and then put it into the river, but he's talking about putting it into the ground.
They're gonna want it at a potable level.
Yeah,
before you-
potable, before you put it into the.
All right, is everyone okay with that recommendation as written, number 3?
Then your number two would be groundwater recharge.
Sorry,
No,
Number 2, so number 2.
Yeah.
It's reflected there.
I use an IPR for groundwater recharge.
Yeah.
As well as the saltwater barriers.
Yeah, 3D.
so I had heard that this was going to be the recommendation and that maybe in the chapter, we could have additional discussion that
Oh,
describes
okay.
what could happen
Okay.
under.
Okay.
So it'd be 3A and.
So this is like not actually the recommendation language. Okay, everyone all right with that? Okay. Okay, that was all that we noted as having come up previously. If anyone else has anything that they want to bring up. Additionally, we have this document that John had sent out, provided, I think in person at the last meeting, that includes all of the technical recommendations from the RBCs that have developed them already and had tried to highlight instances where there were common recommendations coming up between the RBCs. So you can't read that at all.
That's better.
It's a bit better, hopefully. So I just wanted to pull this up, see if anything jumps out at anyone, or also if anyone has anything else that they've just been thinking about outside of the meeting that they want to bring to the group. Please feel free now. So this was groundwater monitoring, enhancing capabilities, you have something like that, regional groundwater model. Future uncertainties you have. Land use changes, don't think you have anything on that yet. Impacts of drawdown of the aquifer. Already taken. Sensitivity of the groundwater models, additional field trips. Future uncertainties. Funding and establishment of a mesoscale network of weather and climate monitoring stations. That's one that a lot of RBCs have had. Land use changes again came up a few times. Continue ecological flow standards. Consider water quality in the future. You already have that. This was about assessing the alignment between the River Basin Plan and other plans, especially designated streams, future scenarios. Stream flow gauges you already have. Ecology relationships, impacts of groundwater. It's all the same. Mesoscale network again, stream flow gauges, water quality, impacts of land use changes.
We go back to the stream flow gauges, because there are other bases outside the Savannah River. We don't have very good stream flow, do we? I mean, I remember that's a piece that's missing from our data.
I think you have that recommendation
Yeah, we have that.
already.
But it's not just the Salkehatchie, I think, Combi and
It doesn't specify in our.
Yeah, so the
Just says-
recommendation you have is number 3 here. To support continued efforts to maintain and expand gauges generally. You can add specificity if you want or leave it.
There's some.
I'll just point out the stream gauges. We've tried to put more stream gauges for stuff that's just. There's just very few places. Again, you always get staged, but when you get discharged, because of the floodplains and the causeways, it's. USGS has done all kinds of work trying to find the sites.
We never talk about the Ashepoo company. The Ashepoo, they're also on our basin. I mean,
Yeah,
There are
yeah,
other-
it is. I think they're. There has
Salkehatchie is the actual. I mean, the company.
Yeah, not that.
So Salkehatchie becomes the company in 17.
Heritage Bridge. Advertised bridge. Yeah,
There has been some gauges added, but it's difficult to find suitable sites if you want discharge.
yeah, I just saw it as it scrolled by.
Yeah.
I missed it. Sorry.
Okay, well, I think you have either adopted or considered a lot of the yellow ones that appeared multiple times. So unless anyone has anything else that they want to bring to the group, can close the technical recommendations part. Okay,
I would say I've been saw a lot that mesoscale network. I mean, I'd be in favor of that. I know just from going through the draft committee meetings and stuff, there's not a lot of dots in our area when they're looking at data. So I mean, it just helps with drought planning and
I would agree.
it seems pretty consistent amongst others.
yes, yeah, it definitely comes up a lot. So,
That's been a recommendation that's been common to every other RBC except the Edisto, and they weren't presented any information on it. So it didn't come up until we started with the second basin, the Broad. But every RBC since the Broad has listened to Hope Mazel's discussion of the need for a mesoscale network and generally agreed that it would be useful.
right, I hear a lot of support for that recommendation. Is anyone against making that recommendation? Okay. All right, anything else? All right. So now we'll get back to the policy, legislative, or regulatory recommendations. So the planning framework says that this could include things such as modifications to existing state or local laws, regulations, or ordinances. It could recommend new versions of those, ideas for recurring funding, or any kind of restructuring. So these are the recommendations that were developed back in the December meeting. Number 3 here is that highlighted version of the number 2, where we started with, where we decided to go with the version that many other RBCs had that did note funding. So this will just be replaced with that. But again, what you came up with previously was starting with a broader, more overarching recommendation to improve the current laws that allow for regulation of water use so that they are effective and enforceable. Then the Surface Water Act should allow for reasonable use criteria to be applied to all surface water withdrawals, like those that currently exist for groundwater withdrawals. South Carolina legislature should establish a grant program to help water users implement the actions that are identified in the legislatively approved state water plan. And it was important to the RBC that it talk about something that's legislatively approved when asking for funding. So that's where the language for that one came from. And the water withdrawal permitting process should specifically assess the permit application's alignment with the legislatively approved state water plan. So coming out of the IRC meeting earlier this week, there were a couple of recommendations to bring to the full group. So the Upper Savannah had recommended that the legislature approve and adopt the state water plan. As I think the discussion has been that it's expected that that would happen, but it's not guaranteed. So the RBC felt that it was important to make that recommendation. So does this RBC want to make a similar recommendation?
Given what's going on between the legislature, the Water SC group, DES, and us, I just don't think that it's clear exactly how this process is ever going to work, how it's going to work. When we say a state water plan, there will be a state water plan adopt some description. Will it have anything to do with the work we're doing here? I have no idea. And so I think part of what we need to do is to say fundamentally that the RBCs need to be officially created by the legislature. I mean, we are a state agency creation, which is unmentioned apart from the funding, I acknowledge, in any state law. There's no record of us There's no assignment of what the responsibilities of this organization are as far as the legislature is concerned. We need, if the RBCs are going to be continuing important and effective bodies, then they have to be formally recognized in state law. I mean, otherwise, we're out there on the edges, waving our hands and yelling, hey, here's what we want. I think we've got to figure out some way, to me, that has to be a recommendation.
I'm trying to think how that relates to the earlier discussions about the recommendation of having the RBCs continue to meet and be funded. Is this something that, builds upon that to state that it should be incorporated into the state
We're
law?
depending upon DES basically asked the legislature in their budget for money to fund essentially organizations that aren't recognized in state law.
So without calling out the RBC specifically, we talked about the value of the RBC is it's consensus based, right? It covers lots of stakeholders, so everyone has a voice.
Great idea.
Without calling out the RBC, can you focus on what we do, the aspects of us that are valuable, the consensus based planning instead of something else. So I just worry about saying that calling our.
I agree. I'm trying to think my way through the best way to express this.
God, how did the RBCs come into creation?
Okay, going back to what David said, about RBCs are legislative. RBCs aren't specifically legislative, that's true, but the name of the act, Water Resources Act, does give at the time DNR the authority to put planning bodies together. It's not real specific how to do that, but it gives them authority to put planning bodies together. And so through that authority, we did put the PPAC together, which developed a framework which called for the creation of a Basin Council. So even though none of these bodies are specifically legislated, the idea of this type of plan group, it is in the law. It's just isn't providing the specifics.
I mean, my gut is that let's not create bureaucracy where we don't need it. So I think they're doing our purpose, right? And if we create this whole big structure of legislative approved, I just don't know. It could create something that maybe we don't need in South Carolina. Add costs to taxpayer. Just a thought.
Does that change your take on it, Dean, or do you want to try to craft some language and put it forth to the RBC?
Well, it does seem to me that it would be one of those things that would have to come up from the legislature. And if all of the RBCs said we need to have some formal recognition about our role in the long-term process, and the legislature needs to acknowledge that one way or the other, either through some amendment to DES's charter, whatever they want to do. If all the RBCs agree on that, then I think it makes sense to put something out there forward. If that's not something that all the RBCs want to stick their neck out on and work on, then I think we need to basically, as RBCs, need to work locally, because in theory, we're a local, we can go around this room and we can tell you exactly, I can't, but collectively, we can tell you exactly who the legislators are that represent this basin. These are the people that are elected here in the legislature. And in theory, in practice, meaning saying to them, hey, you want us to do this, if you do, then acknowledge some in the system. But, I don't have a solution. I'm just thinking about one and I can come up with one.
Yeah.
Couple of weeks, but it's to me, again, I'm just confounded by, and I'll be very frank, I'm confounded by the governor creating Water SC before this work was done, before these plans that we are working on were complete. And there would be a series of documents, or one document, if we work it, which was the basis of everything we created, which would be presented to this Water SC group, and then they could work out whatever they wanted to do in statute. But no, we don't have that. We basically are going along, and all of a sudden, there's this whole new organization which the governor creates, which is now going to theoretically produce a state water plan. And if you look at our schedule and as projected in their schedule, we're not even going to be done with all of this until after theoretically they have adopted. So I'm just trying to figure out how this all works. I mean, what we're doing here, I love it. I think it's incredibly important. And I think all the other base RBCs have done incredibly good, great work, and it's critical stuff for those guys to look at. But that doesn't seem to be affecting anybody at the top of the list in Columbia. So I'm trying to figure out, I don't know, I'm just trying to figure out how it all works together, or how it can work together to produce what I think we want. And I think ultimately what the people of the state of South Carolina, which is a rational water plan that protects these resources and make sure they're available for whatever we want to do in the state in the future. I'm babbling and should be shut up.
I would say that this plan is scheduled to be complete into the summer.
Yeah, we're aiming to have the draft plan in May, get everything approved.
This plan, but we've got other basins that are still just getting stuff. And the whole idea was to get all those basin plans done and then bring them together and produce a document plan which reflected the consensus of the RBCs. Without and leaving the RBC plans alone, because they're good, but creating a state plan which collected the best ideas from all of them. And that's 2 years out.
Well, the same T is being split up.
We will be trying to do that.
So
just on an
the
accelerated.
goal is still to incorporate assuming that. Assuming the water plan is still. Assuming the foundation of the new state water plan is going to be based on the river basin plans. The lower Savannah-Salkehatchie river basin plan should be done in time to incorporate information from this plan. And the goal is to do that for the CMT as well. Is it a challenging schedule? Yes. It's gonna be an interesting year.
But I think, does it meet the initial goal, or are we short circuit? That's what you're saying. But I don't know if that recommendation.
I don't know. I think we should ignore what I'm saying and just move on the things we'll do. But I just want everybody to think about it as we go forward.
Yeah.
What we're doing is important, and what we're recommending is important. Insightful, but slightly grown.
So let's yellow bucket the thought, can think before the next meeting if there's any kind of recommendation that could come out of it, but yeah.
I'm gonna speak
here
to
are the
my senators,
concerns.
and I'm gonna talk to them, so they know basically what's going on.
Grace, I wanted to add one thing to Dean's comment too. At the last Water SC meeting, there was a request from various Water SC members to hear from RBC leadership. So I think that there may be an upcoming meeting where RBC chairs and vice chairs are invited to come and talk directly to Water SC about their river basin plans and begin to discuss some commonalities and recommendations.
Good.
So this conversation came from this potential recommendation from the Upper Savannah that the legislature approve and adopt the state water plan. I think a concern is that we don't know exactly what the state water plan is. So do you want to make that recommendation? Do you want to add some kind of caveat that it incorporates the river basin plans? I think one of the RBCs did that, noting that they want it to be adopted as long as the river basin plans are included as an appendix or something like that. Any strong feelings on this recommendation either way? Well, if no one feels strongly for it, perhaps we leave it off.
No, I think I think it should stay in.
Okay.
I think it should stay. Just,
Do you think it requires any kind of caveat about how it incorporates the river basin plans, or?
let's wait and see where we are now and what we're learning.
So do we want to just yellow bucket this?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yep.
Okay. Fine, yellow bucket.
And I'm going to caution the group against too many yellow buckets because we do want to try to wrap up our recommendations and prepare a draft of chapter 9, but we still do have, a month or two of opportunity to think more about these. So we'll do yellow buckets for now, but in a month or two, we're going to have to turn them to red or green.
Airspeed and altitude.
Okay, this next recommendation came out of someone from the Saluda that wanted to touch on the resilience plan from the state. So the RBC recommends that the comprehensive planning process for each local jurisdiction across the state consult the resilience plan adopted by the South Carolina Office of Resilience, and then the local hazard mitigation plans and any associated river basin plans for inclusion in the resilience element of the comprehensive planning process that's required by this Planning Enabling Act.
That sounds pretty complicated. What does all that mean?
So yeah, I'm definitely not an expert in this, but my understanding is that this act that was amended in 2020 requires that when local jurisdictions do their comprehensive planning process, they have to look at they have to include resilience. So like look to the state plan. Do you want to add something to it, Pete?
No, I just know like on Hilton Head, that's what they're doing right now. They're doing their comp plan update and then so they're creating this, resilience planning to add to the comp plan to satisfy that. But asking them to now also incorporate the RBC there, I don't know.
Yeah, it might be tough to implement for them to know where to look in our 300 page document.
Yeah.
The genesis of this recommendation was Catherine Amadon, who's the vice chair of the Saluda RBC, and in her role as a consultant, she does a lot of comprehensive planning, I believe, with different utilities, planning type projects. So she was pretty familiar with this requirement to include a resilience element in your comprehensive plans. And she just wanted to make the point that, there's a lot of great documents out there that have been generated recently that discuss resilience, including the statewide risk resilience and reduction plan. Our river basin plans touch on resilience, and then local hazard mitigation plan. So her thought was just to encourage local governments to make sure they review anything that has to do with resilience in these diverse plans. I don't know if that helps or not, but that was kind of the genesis.
Seems a little outside of our wheelbox to me. Very specific.
I'm not for it.
Is anyone for this?
I think it does no harm. Yeah, to me, it's a really reinforcing of the direction from another quadrant. But
But the only thing that you said couldn't hurt, but it dilutes our recommendations. So we have a lot of things that aren't crisp.
Yeah.
well, it allows your entire plan to be considered in another.
If somebody reads it and understands what it's saying, which people in here that have been living with it have a hard time.
I'm gonna assume they will know, that people will know what to do with it.
I'm not in favor, honestly.
No,
Anybody consensus?
no, just.
Here we go.
Does anybody else want it besides John? Maybe John?
It's probably worth noting it. We have our rec about doing our outreach and
Mhm.
involving, taking what we're doing and telling our localities. So this would maybe be part of like implementation of that, where hey, various municipality, you're doing your resilience planning, there is this RBC plan. I'm your neighborhood RBC member, here's my PowerPoint, and here's how you look at the plan. It's all, we're kind of covering it.
Mhm.
So if the RBC was done when the resilience plan was written, it should have referenced the RBC effort. We're doing this instead, and I'm just describing it as supporting fire, but it's not in conflict with, it doesn't denigrate from. But it's not a major element.
Mhm. How do you feel about having it in the description of the outreach recommendation where we talk about aligning the river basin plan with other planning efforts in the state?
Makes sense.
That makes sense.
I think that's where, maybe mentioning like resilience or something, but not that whole thing.
Mhm.
Much.
Resilience plan.
Okay, so that won't be its own recommendation, that will just be encompassed in the outreach recommendation. Okay. Okay,
We're planned to death anyway.
what'd you say?
I said, we're all planned to death anyway.
Yes. Okay, those were the two that came out of the IRC for consideration. So now we'll go back to, yes, the parking lot. So there's a lot of discussion at the beginning and throughout the meeting that do we want to start here and crank out that recommendation about coordination at the highest level?
What you might need to go over on policy. Here, with the policy, which is what. Oh, that's wrong, yeah. But yeah.
It has to be more than communication.
Yeah, does anyone have some verbiage that they'd like to put forward on this topic?
All right.
Dean?
The group existed, we had it, it existed and then it went away.
We should have taken it, what you said. We provide the ties if they want to come.
Who's in charge of
The,
cutting
the,
ties? Literal ties.
the governor of South Carolina should communicate with the governor of Georgia and establish a coordinated state level planning and management process for the Savannah River Basin.
You want state level?
Yeah, I get, you could say joint, I guess in there.
Sorry, where did you
Maybe
want
we
to
should,
join?
maybe we should have a little predecessor to it and say, recognizing that the resources of the Savannah River Basin are finite
And shared.
and shared between the states. The governor of South Carolina should communicate with the governor of Georgia to establish a coordinated state level planning and water management process for the Savannah River Basin. That says it. What the structure of it is, how it's laid out, legally what it means. We don't want to get too deep.
Makes states.
Thank you.
We specify the, like, Floridian aquifer and stuff, so. Danger.
Yeah, that,
Or is that getting too specific?
For the Savannah River Basin and the shared groundwater records. How about that?
So we want to really focus this on groundwater.
And
Oh,
for the Savannah River Basin and the shared groundwater records.
Yep.
No, down at the end.
No,
Very
that-
end. Go to the very end.
With groundwater. I think that's good. Thank you.
It has to be in front of the first gun.
That's powerful. Like,
Impressive first take.
yeah. Very well done.
All with the team.
I'm moving the green bucket over, but is anyone opposed to this recommendation?
No.
Okay. All right, so number 2 here was brought up at a past meeting, but there was no representation from ag at that time. This was whether water law and their implementing regulation should distinguish between registrations and permits. And I'm sorry, the gentleman in the back, I met you, but I forgot your name. Are you an ag representative? Okay.
He's not on the council, but that's.
Not on the council, okay. Okay, great, thank you.
back here.
Make her sitting at that table. Okay, so since there's still no ag representatives from the RBC here today, should probably continue to table this.
Does the current statute do that? In other words, we have a statute set up the permitting process for surface water withdrawals and the registration process for agricultural withdrawals. So there are 2 separate withdrawal categories in that statute. One for agriculture, one for municipalities, industries, etc. And municipalities, industry, etc. have to get a permit. Farmers don't have to get a permit, they just have to register and declare what they're gonna pump. So that if I think that already exists.
I think it's saying, should they be different? So it's,
Oh, yeah, it's asking the
so
question.
it's actually it's. I think when this one came up, they were saying, should they be the same? And then we said, there's a question that ag should help us answer. We retain the current system. That's what I would.
Yeah, it's not written as a recommendation as is, it's more of a topic. John, were you gonna say something?
Well, I was just going to say again, the genesis of this potential recommendation was actually the broad RBC, which does not have very much agriculture in the basin. And at the time this recommendation was put forth, which was to do away with registrations and just require permits for all surface water withdrawals, regardless of the type of use. When they developed that recommendation, there really was no ag representation still on the RBC. So other councils have considered this, but generally not agreed with it. I mean, now that said, anywhere in the coastal plain, which, the capacity use areas covers, you're required to get a permit if you're a groundwater user. Registration is not really an option. But here we're specifically talking about surface water. But again, I think only the broad really put forth this recommendation. Other councils have talked about it and have not generally made the same recommendation that there should be no distinction between registrations and permits. Everybody should be required to get a permit for surface water.
And I can know if the ag guys were here, their position would be no.
I think so too, but I would probably put that forth to them separately, like you did with the other. And just.
Yeah, I was going to suggest the same. They were very forthcoming when I asked them about water management strategy. So if I put forward that via email, I think I'll probably get responses, and I expect the response will be that no, we like the current system, but it's worth asking the question.
Yep, I agree. Right. So there was another discussion on whether there's any value in making a distinction between the size or whether an agricultural operation is a local or small operation or a large corporate operation, whether that difference should have any impact on the planning or permitting of the operation. I'm not sure exactly where that discussion came from, but does anyone want to speak to that?
And some of it came through comments that I was taking aboard. And where there's a large corporate agricultural entity created, and because frequently they don't exist in this state, but where it's created, it creates friction between other ag producers and other water users in the immediate area because of the volume of water that's consumed, either, well, mostly it was surface water. But in the case of one, because the surface water got a lot of negative attention, they then went to groundwater and to offset their take of surface water. But there's nothing in state law that I'm aware of that addresses the corporate entity versus a smaller or family-oriented entity. And, you know, I don't know that it'll ever distinguish, but there are certain states where small family entities are predominant, and this is one of those states. And then we have this new thing coming along with this large ag buying up typically numerous farms, consolidating, and then going on a different scale. It's got an economic advantage in terms of processing and production writ large. But in terms of water use, the water usage seems to go up quite significantly.
How are you defining corporate farms versus contract growers for large corporations? I mean, like in the poultry industry in South Carolina, we have 3 or 4 major players in the poultry industry. And those are still family-owned farms, but they may be a big grower for Heyman, or they may be a big grower for Tyson. So I'm just curious how you plan on defining that to not cut out those people too.
Well,
Those are still family-owned farms, and
they are.
yes,
They're family-owned entities as part of a larger corporate entity. So they feed into Purdue or what have you.
I mean, you're gonna have contract growers all across ag. I mean, tobacco, potatoes, peaches, like.
But the example that was brought to my attention is the Waltham Farm example in Aiken County. And that's not what the example that you just put forward.
That's still a family-owned farm. Yes, they're a large grower, they're a Region 8 grower for Lay's potato chips, but they're still a family-owned farm.
They're privately owned, correct.
Why are we contemplating this?
Yeah.
How does it affect the plan? I mean, it seems like a political thing that we probably shouldn't be touching.
Right.
I mean, that's my.
I don't know, but there's definitely a political aspect to it. But the creation of that farm in Aiken County is the reason that the River Basin Council process was restarted or started. It created enough angst and concern among local producers that they wanted the state and elected officials to look at it and deal with it ultimately through the RBCs.
I think what, I remember John bringing this up in December or whenever it was, January. I think he was hoping ag would chime in on it, but I think they've missed the last couple. So I think that's why it's in the parking lot. So.
Send it to ag and ask them.
Yeah, let's do the same thing.
Yeah.
Let's yellow bucket and send it. And
I don't
stick up.
think any of us really are equipped to.
No, we only have another half an hour
Comment
too,
on
so.
how it's impacting us.
Even on the USDA ag census data, I mean, 96% of American farms are family-owned farms. So it's such a small amount. I mean, that's USDA numbers. That's not me pulling a number out of thin air. That's USDA numbers nationally.
Right, but you also have to look at ag and acreages, and that's a different percentage.
Can I just make a suggestion? We can't We can't spend this much time on this. We don't have time. We only have half an hour left, so let's yellow bucket.
Yeah.
Go out to ag and let's move on number 3 and 4.
John, do you feel like you have enough information to be able to phrase something to put to ag?
Yes, I do. I think I can craft a question that kind of gets their feedback and gets at what we're trying to figure out here.
Okay, so number 4, again, it's not worded as a recommendation, but a concept to come back, see if there's any recommendation that you'd like to come from this, but just noting how the flow regime on the Salkehatchie is very different from in many other parts of the state. And should the permit requirements and minimum in-stream flows be reevaluated because of that? And I think it was that there's some instances on the Salkehatchie where more than half of the time the flow gets below the minimum in-stream flow as it's defined by the 20, 30, 40 of the mean annual flow.
I thought we discussed that there's not that many draws on.
There are no surface water permits in the Salkehatchie Basin. It's all registrations used for ag. So it's not really a current problem with permitting or registration, but I think there was just a lingering discussion as, did we want to suggest something different in case somebody wanted to have a permit and pull from the Salkehatchie as opposed to registration. So a permit for, golf course or any other use besides ag. It may be difficult for them to get a permit without having a strong contingency plan in place for the times that flow drops below the minimum stream flow, since in some instances it's like half of the time.
And again, this would require, as far as the registration versus permits, there would almost need to be like a change in the procedure for that to happen, right?
Well, they have to be a change in law and or regulation well, I think that's what this recommendation was getting at, is should there be a change in law or regulation to recognize the unique flow conditions of the Salkehatchie in the event someone wanted to get a permit.
Can we skip this one and move on?
And Leanne is online. Leanne, has this ever come up anywhere other than outside the Salkehatchie where there's been a similar flow regime and somebody's tried to get a permit or wanted to get a permit and they've had to deal with this issue? I'm expecting not, since there's been so few surface water permits that have been issued.
Yeah, you're right. It has not come up.
Okay, didn't think so.
Anybody attached to number 4 parking lot issue?
Yeah, does anybody want to make any kind of recommendation around this? We don't even have to yellow bucket it. We can red bucket if there's no recommendation.
Let's red bucket.
Okay.
Let's briefly discuss number 4 though. Somebody's got to convince me big time to get into this.
You mean number 5?
Or 4, 5, 4, I'm actually, sorry.
Yeah, so 5, John brought up via email. So just again, the question to pose to the RVPD, do you want to make any recommendation on strengthening state laws around the protection of wetlands, given the 2023 Supreme Court decision that loosened the protection of those wetlands?
I mean, it would be a lot of background needed to understand this one.
So that's where this started, was a request for information on what has been the state reaction to that ruling. And does that have traction or meaning with the RBC?
I feel like this one has a lot of impact on the RBCs, but not within this iteration of our RBC plan.
It could be something that
It's gonna have to be revisited in the next iteration, though, I would assume. And that's coming from someone representing the environmental interest and with a legal background and environmental background. So, I mean, this is gonna have huge impacts on the river basin and South Carolina in general, being that we have more salt marsh than almost more salt marsh per acre than any other state in the country. And Beaufort County holds more salt marsh than any other county in the state of South Carolina.
Yeah, the only thing I will correct. My understanding is that the SAC decision did not affect and would not affect salt marsh. It deals with surface water wetlands in particular situations. It would not affect salt marsh. Whether it would affect something in the Savannah-Salkehatchie Basin is another question. But I don't think we should be dealing with this right now.
It's
Too complicated
too soon.
for us at this point.
Is it something that you want to mention somewhere else in the plan? Trying to think of where it could make sense, like as a concern in chapter 3.
I think legally, the legal ramifications, I mean, it's a 2023 decision. Or not even a 2020, it was a 2023 lawsuit, so the decision, I mean, it's still it's not impactful.
So again, going back to what started this was that certain states, not this state, have begun to change state regulations and law based on this ruling.
It's premature.
And in our case, the saltwater is a factor. In many, many other places, the Army Corps term is non-tidal wetlands. So typically, these are areas that are not connected to navigable water or to a coastline.
Well, that's
So those
not
states have
really
started to take action based on the Supreme Court decision. And my question was, is this state doing anything or thinking about it? That's all I was trying to do was get
Let's
the
table it
topic
for
up.
let's table it for a future iteration, because it's really not, I don't think it's.
I don't believe that anywhere in our basin though has non-navigable wetlands. I mean, that are considered non-navigable.
Most of the swamps.
There's a law. Sorry.
The only way I would speak about this in this plan would be to make a recommendation that DES map out wetlands in the state
That are impacted or
that are
potentially
impacted in one way or the other by this statute. In other words, so we just build a database rather than making any
Well, how's it?
laws.
Again, I guess I don't understand how that impacts the quantity of water flow versus demand. I mean,
Surface water,
it's a,
maybe.
yeah, but it's.
I think it's premature.
I think it's premature,
This decision
too.
is not.
Yeah, it's really about quality and we're not addressing this.
Quality, right, and that's not in the first plan. So I'm moved to table it, so.
Yeah.
Okay,
Second.
I agree.
all right.
Second.
I have a couple of other yellow buckets, so we'll add this to yellow to come back to. Maybe John, think about if there's a specific recommendation you wanted to make or somewhere else in the plan that the concern could be raised. Okay, that's all we have in the parking lot for the policy recommendations. Does anyone have anything else that they want to bring to the group? Anyone online?
What about that thing I was bringing up about the trading groundwater permitted capacities? Would
Yeah,
this be the place?
this would be the place.
All right,
Where's trading?
SCDES should refrain. Hey, y'all can hold me here. Just agree that. Effort. Should refrain from requiring
I don't know what we want to do.
the trading of permitted groundwater withdrawal capacities between aquifer systems in order for permittees to obtain withdrawal permits absent an analysis of available capacities within the subject aquifer system.
i.e.
Wait,
Orange
what?
Spring.
Wow.
Wow, that sounds like a lawyer.
We already said they don't have capacities.
That's right.
So you're just saying they can't do anything, you just.
Can we dumb that down just a tiny bit?
You gotta consider that, you know,
You said
ten
stop.
words or less.
Okay.
Can you kind of restate why the, because a couple people were missing from when you brought this up earlier, can you kind of restate why? you
Just
making
this subject of, experience where in order to obtain groundwater withdrawal capacity from one aquifer system, permitted capacity in another aquifer system had to be given back, traded.
Why?
That you would have to ask the state, or, you know, they were trying to meet certain goals. So the concern, just like we talked earlier, the concern is, well, without using the capacity standpoint, is that practice a little bit problematic?
A capacity that they don't even know
Right.
what it is.
Well, doesn't
That's all I was, that's all I.
doesn't the state issue capacity for permits where it's not even being used and doesn't revisit the capacity of those permits?
What aquifers are those?
No, they don't. They don't take it back, do they?
Yeah, like in this particular case,
No, in your case, but
Yeah.
others they don't. So
Well, we're also in clear.
Can I clarify some stuff that I'm hearing? Okay, so I've heard two different things on groundwater permits and I guess theoretical permit capacity, but this is for groundwater, right? We're talking about groundwater.
Yes.
Okay, so I'm just going to use a vague example. Let's say someone has a new permit, they come to me, they want 100 million gallons a year. And based on their application, it seems reasonable. So we issue an application, or we issue a permit for 100 million gallons a year. After the first 5 years, we review. We only have 5 years of data, so we're not going to change that right now. We're going to let them keep that 100 million gallons. After another 5 years, so now we have 10 years of data, we look at their water use and how it has potentially changed. And if, let's say, their highest use over those 10 years is 40 million gallons a year, well, we would take that number, multiply it by 1.2 to get like a 20% buffer on that highest use. And then we would recommend issuing a permit for that number instead of reissuing it for 100 million gallons. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Makes sense.
And we would talk with the permittee and see if there was any plans for expansion or additional acreage or whatever that facility was. So I'm talking about, I'm pretty vague, but if they have been using that 100 million gallons, if they've been using like 80 and 90, then we of course would tell them to keep that. And we may even suggest, hey, you're starting to butt up close to your permit limit. Would there be a reason that we should maybe increase that to 20% above that limit that you have been using? So we do like to, with these groundwater permits, we do review their use and communicate with the permittee and talk about potential reductions in their permit if needed, but we also talk about potential increases if it looks like they need that. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay, did that answer some questions or confusion there?
The situation I'm at is between different aquifer systems.
Right. And so with different aquifer systems, let's say I have a well in McQueen and I want to sell it to somebody else and they currently have a permit in the Crouch Branch. Well, if I'm, or let's say I had 2 wells in the McQueen and I sell one of my wells, but I want to keep my current capacity that I have for that one well, but I'm getting rid of the other well to somebody that only has Crouch Branch wells. Now they're adding a McQueen Branch well to their permit. I'm going to make them public notice that new aquifer because for their permit, they are increasing their withdrawal volume in a new aquifer compared to what they currently have. And we would review and ensure that it's not going to cause a problem, which theoretically it wouldn't because the current permittee with both wells has not potentially caused an issue. But we would review and re-public notice that well because the new user is technically getting an increased withdrawal out of that aquifer because the original owner is keeping their current volume. So it is the permitted volume in that aquifer is increasing if it is being sold that way. Does that make sense?
Yeah, yeah.
So I have a question for you. If we don't have data on the aquifers, how much they have in them, et cetera, enough to give us any quantities for this report, how do you then know whether somebody can get 100 or 300 or 1 billion gallons a day per? What data?
So a lot of times they, depending on who it is and how much they plan to withdraw, either one, the well driller that's involved with the project will know, like, hey, I know the wells in this area have been doing it for decades, and wells in this area typically have that capacity. Or if they're, a lot of water suppliers will do pump tests first, and they will get a permit to construct a test well, and they'll do that first before constructing their main withdrawal well. And we also, of course, look at everyone's reported use as well as potentiometric maps that have been produced and that sort of thing.
But it seems then we have data to come to some conclusions for groundwater without the model.
Some, I don't have like exact drawdown information or anything, but looking at the maps, we can make educated decisions.
I mean, the big picture here, what we're driving at is this need for, as best as we can, some kind of concept on capacities when we're talking groundwater.
So
Just like
in the case of Hilton Head, why was there a horse trade? Why were they just granted the additional capacity? What did you all see that said, no, you can't have additional capacity, but you can trade this for this? Is there some data that was based on, or was it arbitrary?
It's hard to answer them. They were, in our particular case, you could look and say there's permitted capacity that isn't used, and so it isn't it's not a risk or removal, and gives the capacity use zone some buffer there that you're not going to bump up against what you already had in a threatened aquifer system.
How about this? Come up with something, say consider it, but we only have 15 minutes.
Yeah,
I just don't. If we can't do it right now.
Yeah, you did come up with something. We have it written here. So I think the question is, do you want to,
Fine, yes.
yeah, think about it some more and pose it to the group at the next time?
Probably not.
Can I just make a general comment or observation about the buckets that we got here, yellow buckets in particular? That going forward, regardless of whether they're adopted or not, there seems to be level of interest and or need for some inquiry in some of these areas that would be useful. But not necessarily to the point of being a recommendation.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
Areas of interest or something we could put a plan.
yeah, and I noted in chapter 3, there's a place where we can talk about concerns that were raised at some point during the RBC.
I'm not sure these are concerns as
Yeah.
much as they are just legitimate interest and inquiries that deserve some additional information.
So maybe just some discussion to supplement the recommendations. Okay. All right, well, we're running up against the end here, so we're not going to get to the implementation plan today. This is where we can pick back up at the next meeting. But John distributed this to the group, and that was based on the recommendations that you had developed prior to this meeting. So after this, we'll go back, add in all the new recommendations that you've come up with, and start to fill out that table for those recommendations as well. And just for a little bit of background as you're reviewing it, the implementation plan follows the framework, or the state water planning framework, and how it says that the implementation plan should be laid out. So there are overarching objectives that try to capture all of the recommendations that have come out of your planning process, from the water management strategies that are presented in chapter 7, the drought management strategies in chapter 8, and then all of these other planning, regulatory, technical recommendations that are in chapter 9. So we tried to group them into these overarching objectives, come up with the specific strategies that try to achieve those objectives, and those strategies are pretty much the recommendations. And then taking it to the implementation step, there's actions associated with each of those strategies. And the framework calls to develop a schedule of what actions would take place in the first 5 years. So what would happen right after the plan is published, what would be ongoing, or what might happen in the 5-year update. And then as we're able to try to come up with some concept of budget and potential funding sources that could be available. So hopefully that just helps the implementation plan make a little bit more sense as you're looking at it, but we'll go through it in more detail at the next meeting. So the tentative schedule is we'll do the implementation plan in April, and then develop progress metrics that you'll basically use after the plan is published to see how well you're doing against your implementation plan, what you laid out to do. April 22nd is the field trip scheduled for the Savannah River site. I think there's still some requirements you have to meet if you wish to attend this. John, can you step in and say what anyone needs to do?
Yeah, just need to make sure you register through the link that I had circulated more than a month ago. And I think most people that are interested in doing the tour probably have already done that. But this is just a reminder if you haven't. I think Jeff suggested that needs to be done at least a couple weeks minimum before the tour. So, get it done by the next RBC meeting on the 3rd, and you should be fine.
Thank you.
And that's solid, that's on.
Yes, yeah, unless we have another Hurricane Helene or something between now and then, we're good to go.
All right, then May, we're scheduled to get you out the draft executive summary and review the whole plan. If we're able to finish up the implementation plan and the progress metrics in the next meeting, we should still be able to stick with a schedule of the chapters that we laid out at the start of the meeting, where you will have seen everything by mid-April, so have a couple of weeks prior to that meeting on the 1st. Not sure if we would be able to vote on it on May 1st, or if that would potentially get pushed to June. Then be able to have a public meeting, I think 30 days after you have reviewed and voted on the draft plan. Address any comments, and then have you vote on the final plan potentially in August, and then have a second public meeting. Anything else to say on that, John?
No, I think that pretty much covers it. For the April 3rd meeting, we'll do a final revisit at the beginning of the meeting of some of these yellow bucket recommendations. And, I may allocate half hour, 45 minutes just to finish that discussion, but then we'll dive right into the implementation plan. We will recirculate the implementation plan at least a week before the meeting so that we can be efficient on April 3rd. As we review that implementation plan, I encourage you to take a look at it. It does get kind of tedious to go through the implementation plan during the RBC meetings because there's a lot of detail there. So I guess I'd encourage you to all look at it closely, and if you have specific comments, we can address them during the meeting, but that'll help us avoid going item by item, action by action through that plan. It's also a little bit tedious to develop these progress metrics and go through them. In other RBCs, it's taken several hours sometimes. So we will take a shot at developing those ahead of time and sending them to you. In fact, you got a preview of them in the meeting slides that we sent out earlier this week. Those will be tweaked a little bit based on the new recommendations we've included, but they'll generally be the same. So I'd encourage you all to read those closely too, to make that discussion as fast as possible. I think that's all I wanted to add. We're going to be sending you a lot of information to review, so look forward to any comments that you might have. So far, we've only received just a few comments on the chapters. I'm not necessarily trying to encourage you to submit comments. We'd love to have your comments. Every RBC is different. The Saluda RBC submitted more than 500 comments on draft chapters. You guys have submitted so far only a couple, but you've only seen, I think, 3 chapters. I just encourage you to at least review them, and if you have questions or comments, get those comments to us within the initial 2-week review period. Obviously, you'll have another chance to provide comments once you see the whole plan in draft format. I think that's all, Grace. Yeah.
Meetings, do you have a format and do you have approximate locations in mind for those?
For the public meetings?
Correct.
We have a format that we've been following with each of the RBCs, and I can share that with you perhaps at the April meeting, if not definitely during the May meeting. It's basically I'd say 40-minute presentation that hopefully RBC members will help and take the lead in giving, that covers the highlights of the River Basin Plan. So it's kind of a executive summary given in presentation form of the River Basin Plan. Here's the major findings, here's the strategies we considered, and here's some of the most important recommendations the council developed. As far as the locations, I haven't talked about that yet with DES, but maybe Walterboro, and could also be a second one, maybe up in the northern part of the basin, like the Edisto Rec.
Question on the public meetings, have there been substantial or any public participation in the other RBC public meetings?
Attendance has been minimal, fairly sparse. There have been public comments made at some of the RBC public meetings. Usually only 2 or 3 speakers at the most, sometimes none. So they haven't been as well as attended as I'd like to see them.
How much notification is given, like where is it advertised?
Scott can probably best address that. They have an email list, I know, but Scott, do you want to answer that?
Posted or announced 30 days in advance.
Where?
On our website, and then we do a press release through email or DES.
So like,
And then we'll ask Clemson to send it out on their email list.
so basically just people who subscribe to DNR and DES and Clemson newsletters get it?
No, we've also got a state and federal list, and we've got people.
We have to do a press release, media outlets, they send that to how do you like to.
So nobody knows. Nobody subscribes or, I mean, it sounds like there's just a very limited reach.
It goes through marketing too.
I don't think it's so limited. I'm on the council because of that outreach for the initial public meeting. So I saw it in an email. So it's.
Send it out with the council of governments too.
It's about a reach.
But I'm sure you have your fingers in things because you hunt and fish and do all that stuff too, so.
My wife signed up for flowers to make that. It came in through the DNR. I don't know. And I would say, hey,
DES.
I think it's DNR, SCDNR.
it was DNR and the mission.
That's a huge population of hunters and all that.
Yeah, I mean, I got it.
Like it's the weather reports too. So.
I found out about the council, just, Camp Wildwood and.
So I think the
For
distribution is broad. It's just whether someone's gonna be interested or not is right now. Because I think the few people that were there are here. So. That's true.
I mean, the only reason I even knew this council existed is because, I've all.
All right, any other questions on the upcoming schedule?
Nope.
All right, well, thank you all for coming today.
Before we adjourn, I'd just like to thank Grace coming down from Boston to facilitate.
All the way from
And then John, we hope you get better. We're looking forward to seeing you again soon.
Thank you, and I want to thank Grace too. She spared me on my birthday, and more importantly, it's also my wife's birthday. So I'm going to be able to go to dinner with my wife tonight on our birthdays.
Happy birthday.
Thank you.
Get her ill.
All right, thank you.
Thank you.